of the Secretary of State are truly shocking. Both the fact that there are 456 people who lost their lives following inappropriate prescribing of opioids, and the fact that there was a closing of ranks which prevented families from getting to the truth. Does she agree that there now needs to be an independent and thorough police investigation by another force? Will she also agree to meet with me, together with family representatives, to discuss the implications of this report? And does she agree that we must never again ignore families in this way, and that there must be a mechanism when allegations of wrongdoing are raised so that they are investigated immediately, including the families?
I'd say to the Right Honourable Gentleman, first of all, that my thoughts, and I'm sure the thoughts of everybody across this House, will be with all the families of patients who died as a result of what happened at Gosport Hospital. The events at Gosport Memorial Hospital were tragic, they are deeply troubling, and they brought unimaginable heartache to the families concerned, but they are a matter of which we should be concerned across this House. And he raises an issue about the way in which the public sector often, in his terms, closes ranks. I think this is one of the issues that we need to deal with across the public sector. And if I may say, I pay tribute to the Right Honourable Gentleman for having established the inquiry when he was a minister. I'm sorry that it took so long for the families to get the answers from the NHS. I'd like to thank Bishop James Jones and his fellow panel members for what they've done. I'd be happy to meet the Right Honourable Gentleman with Bishop Jones. And can I also say that I think this shows why it is absolutely right that my Right Honourable friend, the Health and Social Care Secretary, has been putting such a focus on patient safety and transparency in the NHS, because we need to ensure that we do not see these sorts of these things happening in the future. And the findings are obviously distressing. They are deeply concerning. Of course, measures have been put in place to deal with issues, but my Right Honourable friend, the Health Secretary, will be making a statement shortly.
Mrs Anne Main.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Peak hurricane season is due to hit Bangladesh and the Rohingya in the camps. The UK is leading in aid to the Rohingya. Other countries pledge aid but do not deliver. What more can this government do to put pressure on those countries who renege on their pledges of aid to the Rohingya?
Well, my honourable friend has raised a very important point. I think the first point she's raised, which is important, is that this is a country that not only says what it's going to do, but actually puts its money where its mouth is and goes out and helps people across the world, including the Rohingya in the circumstances that she's referred to. We will continue to put pressure on all those countries who say they will do something, but then don't actually deliver the money to ensure that they do.
Ed Miliband.
Speaker, I want to return to the broader context of the question asked by my honourable friend, the member for Luton South. This has been a chilling week, Mr Speaker, for those of us right across this House who believe in values of tolerance and diversity. Not just President Trump, Viktor Orban proposing a new tax on organisations that defend refugees, the Italian government targeting the Roma people. It's good that she said President Trump's policy is wrong, but Mr Speaker, I want her to do more, and I think this House wants her to do more. What is she going to do proactively to defend these values? What is she going to do to work with Chancellor Merkel and President Macron to make clear to the rest of the world and the European Union that these values that are so inimical to our country cannot stand?
Well, can I say to the Right Honourable Gentleman that we do work with governments across Europe, particularly with the French and German governments, on these issues of migration in relation to Europe. We expect all members of the international community to adhere to international law and commitments to human rights. As a government, we oppose extremism in all forms, including when such extremism threatens to damage ethnic and community relations. We believe in the fundamental values of liberty, of democracy, of respect for human rights. We will continue to work with others to ensure that it is those values that are preeminent in everything that we and they do.
Salou.
The Prime Minister's renewed commitment to the NHS is extremely welcome. Recently, the Health and Social Care Select Committee visited the Larwood House GP surgery in Worksop, where generally all patients are seen by the doctors the same day. What more can the government do to make sure that this best practice amongst GP practices is spread across the whole country so all our constituents can get in to see a doctor when they need to?
My honourable friend raises a very important point, and one of the principles underpinning what we will be looking to the NHS to do across its 10-year plan is to ensure that the best practice that we see in many parts of the NHS is indeed spread across the whole of the NHS, so that patients are able to get the access and the same standards that they need across the National Health Service. I commend the work that has been done in the GP surgery that he has referred to in his constituency. This is very important, and I also commend work that is being done elsewhere to bring services together to ensure that patients see an improvement in the care and treatment that they receive.
Finally for today, Angela Eagle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The last Labour government oversaw a 5.9% increase in spending on the NHS. The Thatcher major government managed 3.6%. So far, her predecessor David Cameron and the Right Honourable Lady have managed 1.9%. Why, therefore, are we meant to be happy and amazed by her unfunded pledge to deliver an increase of 3.4%, which is under the annual average achieved since the NHS was first created?
I say to the Right Honourable Lady that this is, as I clearly said from the Chief Executive of NHS England, he recognises that this is the funding that the NHS needs. But crucially, giving a multi-year funding settlement based on a long-term 10-year plan will give the NHS the stability and certainty that it needs to be able to introduce the transformation we all want to see in patient care. And we will also be ensuring that, unlike what happened under the Labour Party, this money will be seen in improved patient care.
Order. Sorry? Well, points of order come after the statement. We have a statement from the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care in a moment. Order. Statement, the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, Secretary Jeremy Hunt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This morning, the Gosport Independent Panel published its report on what happened at Gosport Memorial Hospital between 1987 and 2001. Its findings can only be described as truly shocking. The panel found that over the period, the lives of over 450 patients were shortened by clinically inappropriate use of opioid analgesics, with an additional 200 lives also likely to have been shortened if missing medical records are taken into account. The first concerns were raised by brave nurse whistleblowers in 1991, but then systematically ignored. Families first raised concerns in 1998, and they too were ignored. In short, there was a catalogue of failings by the local NHS, Hampshire Constabulary, the GMC, the NMC, the coroners, and as steward of the system, the Department of Health. Nothing I say today will lessen the anguish and pain of families who have campaigned for 20 years for justice after the loss of a loved one. But I can, at least on behalf of the government and the NHS, apologise for what happened and what they have been through. Had the establishment listened, when junior NHS staff spoke out? Had the establishment listened when ordinary families raised concerns instead of treating them as troublemakers, many of those deaths would not have happened. I also want to pay tribute to those families for their courage and determination to find the truth. As Bishop James Jones, who led the panel, says in his introduction, what has to be recognised by those who head up our public institutions is how difficult it is for ordinary people to challenge the closing of ranks of those who hold power. It is a lonely place seeking answers that others wish you were not asking. I also thank Bishop Jones and his panel for their extremely thorough and often harrowing work. And I particularly want to thank the Right Honourable Member for Norfolk North, who as my Minister of State in 2013 came to me and asked me to overturn the official advice he had received that there should not be an independent panel. I accepted this advice and can say today that without his campaigning in and out of office, justice would have been denied to hundreds of families. In order to maintain trust with the families, the panel followed a families first approach in its work, which meant the families were showed the report before it was presented to Parliament. I too saw it for the first time only this morning, so today is an initial response and the government will bring forward a more considered response in the autumn. That response will need to consider the answers to some very important questions. Why was the Baker report, completed in 2003, only able to be published 10 years later? The clear advice was given that it could not be published during police investigations and whilst inquests were being concluded. But can it be right for our system to have to wait 10 years before learning critically important lessons which could save the lives of other patients? Likewise, why did the GMC and NMC, the regulators with responsibility for keeping the public safe from rogue practice, again take so long? The doctor principally involved was found guilty of serious professional misconduct in 2010. But why was there a 10-year delay before her actions were considered by a fitness to practice panel? And whilst the incident seemed to have involved one doctor in particular, why was the practice not stopped by supervising consultants or nurses who would have known from their professional training that these doses were wrong? And why did Hampshire Constabulary conduct investigations that the report says were limited in their depth and range of offences pursued? And why did the CPS not consider corporate liability and health and safety offences? And why did the coroner and assistant deputy coroner take nearly 2 years to proceed with inquests after the CPS had decided not to prosecute? And finally, and more broadly, was there an institutional desire to blame the issues on one rogue doctor rather than examine systemic failings that prevented issues being picked up and dealt with quickly, driven, as the report suggests it may have been, by a desire to protect organisational reputations? I want to reassure the public that important changes have taken place since these events, which would make the catalogue of failures listed in the report less likely. These include the work of the CQC as an independent inspectorate with a strong focus on patient safety, the introduction of the duty of candour, the Learning from Deaths programme, and the establishment of medical examiners across NHS hospitals from next April. But today's report shows we still need to ask ourselves searching questions as to whether we've got everything right. And we will do this as thoroughly and quickly as possible when we come back to the House with our full response. Families will also want to know what happens next, and I hope that they and honourable members will understand the need to avoid making any statement that could prejudice the pursuit of justice. The police, working with the CPS and clinicians as necessary, will now carefully examine the new material in the report before determining their next steps, and in particular, whether criminal charges should now be brought. In my own mind, I am clear that any further action by the relevant criminal justice and health authorities must be thorough, transparent, and independent of any organisation that may have an institutional vested interest in the outcome. For that reason, Hampshire Constabulary will want to consider carefully whether further police investigations should be undertaken by another police force. My department will provide support for families from today as the panel's work is now concluded, and I intend to meet as many of the families as I can before we give our detailed response in the autumn. I'm also delighted that Bishop James Jones has agreed to continue to provide a link to the families and lead a meeting with them in October to allow them to understand progress on the agenda and any further processes that follow the report. I also commend the role played by the current member for Gosport, who campaigned tirelessly for an independent inquiry and is unable to be here today because she is with the affected families in Portsmouth. For others who are reading about what happened and have concerns it may also have affected their loved ones, we put in place a helpline, and the number is available on the Gosport Independent Panel website and the DHSC website. And we're putting in place counselling provision for those affected by these tragic events and who would find it helpful. Let me finish by quoting again from Bishop Jones's foreword to the report. He talks powerfully about the sense of betrayal felt by families because, and I quote, handing over a loved one to a hospital, to doctors and nurses is an act of trust, and you take for granted they will always do that which is best for them. Today's report will shake that trust, but we should not allow it to cast a shadow over the remarkable dedication of the vast, vast majority of people working incredibly hard on the NHS front line. And working with those professionals, the government will leave no stone unturned to restore that trust. And I commend this statement to the House.
Just before I call the Shadow Secretary of State, reference was made in passing to this by the Secretary of State, but I think it is only fair to mention to the House that a number of colleagues whose constituencies have been affected by the events at Gosport Hospital are unable to speak in these exchanges because they serve either as ministers or as, in one case, Parliamentary Private Secretary to the Prime Minister. A number of those affected individuals are present here on the front bench, and I think that should be acknowledged and respected. I'm referring, of course, to the members for Gosport, for Portsmouth North, for Fareham, and indeed for Meon Valley. The Shadow Secretary of State for Health, Jonathan Ashworth.
Grateful, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Secretary of State for advance copy of his statement and welcome the tone of his remarks and indeed the apology he has offered on behalf of the Government and the National Health Service. This is a devastating, shocking and heartbreaking report, and our thoughts must be with the families of the 456 patients whose lives were shortened. Can I, like the Secretary of State, pay tribute to the Right Honourable Member for North Norfolk, whose persistence in establishing this inquiry in the face of a bureaucracy, in his own words, which attempted to close ranks, must be applauded. I know other members have played an important part as well, like the Honourable Member for Eastbourne is in his place, and the Right Honourable Lady, the Care Minister, who's quite understandably and quite properly in her Gosport constituency this afternoon. And can I finally place on record my thanks to all who served on the inquiry panel and offer particular thanks for the extraordinary dedication, the calm, the compassionate, relentless and determined leadership, yet again, of the former Bishop of Liverpool, James Jones, in uncovering an injustice and in revealing a truth about a shameful episode in our nation's recent history. As the Secretary of State quoted, the Right Reverend James Jones said, handing over a loved one to a hospital, to doctors and nurses, is an act of trust, and you take for granted that they will always do that which is best for the one you love. That trust was betrayed. He goes on, a large number of patients and their relatives understood that their admission to the hospital was for either rehabilitation or respite. They were, in effect, put on a terminal care pathway. Mr. Speaker, others will come to their own judgment, but for me, that is unforgivable. Now, this is a substantial 400-page report, only published in the last hour or so, and it will take some time for the House to fully absorb each and every detail. But can I offer a few reflections and ask a few questions of the Secretary of State? Unlike the Secretary of State, the question lingers in my mind is how could this have been allowed to go on for so long? How could so many warnings go unheeded? The report is clear. Concerns were first raised in 1991 by a nurse. The hospital chose not to rectify the practice of prescribing the drugs involved. And by the time concerns were raised at a national level, the report runs through a complicated set of back and forths about what to do, what sort of inquiry would be appropriate between different versions of health trusts and successor health trusts, different versions of management bodies, different national bodies. An inquiry was eventually conducted which found an almost routine use of opiates and which also said almost certainly shortened the lives of some patients. It seems that that report was left on a shelf gathering dust. And it may well be, I am sure, that many of the officials and players acted in good faith, but taken as a whole, there was a systematic failure to properly investigate what went wrong and rectify. And in the words of the report, when faced with serious allegations, they handled them in a way that was to limit the impact on the organisation and its perceived reputation. The consequence of that failure was devastating. But to this day, of course, the NHS landscape, quite understandably, remains complex and is often fragmented. How confident is the Secretary of State that similar failures, if God forbid they were to happen again somewhere, would be more easily rectified in the future? Equally, as the Secretary of State recognises, there are questions for Hampshire Constabulary. As the report says, the quality of the police investigations was constantly poor. Why is it that police investigated the deaths of 92 patients and yet no prosecutions were brought? And could the Secretary of State tell us what discussions he has had, withstanding the fact the report has only just been published, but what earlier discussions will he be having with the Home Secretary to ensure that police constabularies in the future are equipped to carry out investigations of this nature if, again, anything so devastating was to happen anywhere else? And what about the voice of the families? Why did families who had lost loved ones have to take on such a burden, have to take on such a toll to demand answers? It's clear that the concerns of families were too often, too readily dismissed, treated as irritants. It's shameful. No family should be put through that. So how can he ensure that family voice is fully heard in the future? I recognise the Secretary of State has done work on this in the past, and I do pay tribute to him, I genuinely do. But how can he ensure that families' voice is strengthened in the future? Now, of course, the Secretary of State is quite right that we must be cautious in our remarks today, but can he give me this reassurance that all the relevant authorities will properly investigate and take this further, and that if there is a police investigation, can he guarantee that a different force will carry out that investigation? Now, more generally, can I just ask, can he give us some reassurance that he is satisfied that the oversight of medicines in the NHS is now tight enough that incidents like this could never be allowed to happen again? What wider lessons are there for patient safety in the NHS, and does he believe that additional legislation is now required? Does he see any need for any tightening of the draft Patient Safety Investigations Bill to reflect learning from this case? In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, the Right Reverend James Jones has provided a serious, devastating, far-reaching service and a far-reaching report. Aggrieved families have had to suffer the most terrible injustice. We rightly acknowledge in the next few weeks the 70 years of our National Health Service, and the Secretary of State is right to say this must not cast a shadow over the extraordinary work of health professionals every day in our NHS. But on this occasion, the system has let so many down. We must ask ourselves why it was allowed to let so many down and dedicate ourselves to ensuring it never happens again.
Secretary of State.
Well, I thank the Shadow Health Secretary for the considered tone of his comments, and actually I agree with everything he says. And I think across the House, members will understand that we are all constrained in what we can say about the individual doctor concerned, because that now is a matter for the police and the CPS to come forward. But of course, what we're not constrained in debating and we should debate fully, is not just today but going forward, is what the system lessons are to be learned. And the big question, I think, for us is not so much how could this have happened once, because in a huge healthcare system you are unfortunately always going to get occasionally things that go wrong, however horrific that sometimes is, but how could it have been allowed to go on for so long without being stopped? And in some ways, reflecting on his comments, the poor treatment of whistleblowers, the ignoring of families, the closing of ranks, it's wrong. We must stop it. We must go further than we've gone to date. But in a way, it's straightforward because we know exactly what the problem is, and we've just got to make sure that that culture changes. The bit that is more difficult is where there were process issues that happened in good faith but had a terrible outcome. And in particular, I think that this report is a salutary lesson about the importance of transparency, because if you read it, and I must admit I only obviously had a couple of hours to read it, so not very long, but what it looks like is this Baker report was left to gather dust for 10 years for the perfectly straightforward and understandable reason that people said it can't be published in the course of a police investigation or while an inquest is going on. Had it been published, I'm speculating here, but I am pretty certain the transparency would have prompted much more rapid action. And some of the things that we may now decide to do, we would have done much, much earlier. And I think it is an incredibly powerful argument for transparency that sadly has been lacking. So how confident can I be this wouldn't happen again? I do think that the culture is changing in the NHS, and I do think that the NHS is more transparent and more open, and I think that interactions with families are much better than they were. But I don't by any means think that we are there. And I think that we will uncover from this a number of things that we're still not getting right. As he will understand, it's not a decision for the government as to which police force conducts these investigations. We have separation of powers. That has to be a matter for the police. But I think one of the things that we have to ask ourselves with respect to police investigations is whether police forces have access to the expertise they need to know whether they should really be prioritising an investigation. Because when you have that closing of ranks in the medical establishment, it's very difficult for the police sometimes to know that they should be challenging that. And it does appear like that is one of the things that happened. And in terms of the wider lessons with respect to the oversight of medicines and the Healthcare Safety Investigation Branch Bill, we will certainly take on board whether there are any changes that need to be made there.
Gillian Keegan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The culture of closing ranks and ignoring whistleblowers in the NHS is gravely worrying, and even as a new MP, I feel that this could still happen today, and have had constituency cases where people have alerted me to this. What implications for the wider health service, and particularly elderly care, people who have patients, family in these situations today? What does the Minister believe this report holds? What are the implications for those families?
Well, I think there's one very important point that the Shadow Health Secretary mentioned, which I think is important to understand from this report, is that we very often have a problem where people in an end-of-life situation are not treated in the way that we would want for our own relatives or parents. And, you know, to put it very bluntly, there is a worry that someone's end may be hastened more quickly than it should be, and we've made a number of changes, including scrapping the Liverpool Care Pathway, which happened under the coalition government. But in this case, these patients were not in an end-of-life situation, so they were actually going to this hospital for rehabilitation and expecting to recover, but they were old. And so one of the things that we are going to have to try and understand, all of us, is how this could have been allowed to happen, how this culture, because I'm afraid the report is very clear that insofar as this doctor was responsible, and I have to be careful with my words here, lots of other people knew what was going on.
Martin Day.
Thank you. I'm very grateful for the Secretary of State for the advance copy of his statement. There is much in it that I agree with both in tone and in content. These are truly horrific events, and our first thoughts must always be with the families of those who have been affected by this scandal. It is deeply distressing to lose a loved one in any circumstances, and the circumstances around this and the press coverage will no doubt have amplified that distress to everyone concerned. When the inquiry was originally announced, it was expected to take 2 years, and it is extremely disappointing that it has stretched until now. There has no doubt been a catastrophic failure of monitoring and accountability, not only with regard to the doctor concerned, but also to those who failed to investigate these actions. And this failure also includes the government. However, I'm grateful for the Secretary of State for issuing the apology which he has made today, and I do welcome the fact that the government will bring forward more considered responses in the autumn. I sincerely hope that this will begin the beginning of justice and ultimately closure for the families affected, and I would ask that I hope the Minister will support the opening of criminal investigations into these events following the findings. The public find it very difficult to have faith in the health regulators who act both as the investigators and the prosecutors and even the judge in complaints, and I hope the Secretary of State will look at this aspect to ensure public confidence and faith in the system of health regulations going forward.
Yeah. Well, I thank the Honourable Gentleman for his comments, and I agree with what he said. Of course, if the police decide to bring forward criminal prosecutions, that would have the support of the government, but they must make that decision independently. I think one of the questions that is raised by this is, if you are a family who feels that an injustice has been done, who is there for you to go for? If you feel that ranks are being closed, and I think we need to reflect very carefully whether, I think we made progress, but whether we made enough progress on that. Bless you.
Alan Mack. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The events at the hospital and the panel's reports are of significant interest to me and my constituents in Havant, and those of my honourable friend, the member for Meon Valley, on whose behalf I'm also speaking today. His constituents and mine have asked whether the families can be confident that the report's findings will be acted upon and that people will be held accountable for what happened.
Secretary of State.
Well, he is right to ask that question, and I think the best parallel is the Hillsborough process, which was also led by Bishop Jones, and a similar report was published which put documents into the public arena that essentially enable people to understand truthfully what happened, and on the basis of that then inquests were reopened and criminal prosecutions happened and so on. So we're at that stage of the process. But I hope that the transparency, the thoroughness of that report will give families hope that they are at last being listened to.
Mr. Norman Lamb.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I first of all thank the Secretary of State for backing and trusting my judgment in 2013 without hesitation in proceeding with this panel inquiry. And can I join him also in paying tribute to the work of Bishop James Jones and the whole panel. Bishop James Jones, I think, is a remarkable man who has shown extraordinary clarity of thought, but has also built the trust of families who have been involved in this process in a very impressive way. I'm not sure I share his confidence that an earlier publication of the Baker report would have resulted in the transparency he called for, bearing in mind that I had to intervene in 2013 to stop a statement being made that there would be no public inquiry, even after the publication of that report. Does he agree that we have to find a way of overcoming the problem of different inquiries through inquests, through police, through regulators, which together stopped the vital information getting out into the public domain and stopped proper investigation into those issues? And does he agree also that we need to have a mechanism to ensure that in future families are never ignored again, that when legitimate allegations of wrongdoing are made, that they are investigated properly and that families are involved in that process?
Well, first of all, I once again pay tribute to the role he took, because one of the most difficult things for any government minister is knowing when to accept advice, which is what you do most of the time, and when actually to overrule it. And his instincts have been proved absolutely right on that, but it isn't an easy thing to do. It causes all sorts of feathers to be ruffled, and he stuck to his guns, and absolutely rightly so. Bishop James Jones, who is a truly remarkable public servant, used a phrase in the Hillsborough panel report. He talked about the patronising disposition of unaccountable power. And that is what we have to be incredibly guarded against. And he is right. At the heart was this problem that we didn't listen to families early enough. We didn't listen to whistleblowers inside the NHS early enough. And I think that my reason for saying that all these things need to see the sunlight of transparency much sooner is frankly that if proper attention had been given to this in 2001, we all know that Mid-South started in 2005. I mean, how many other lessons throughout the health service, how many other tragedies could potentially have been avoided if these things had come to light sooner? And so that is why I think it would be the wrong reaction today to say that we're getting there on patient safety, transparency problems are solved. I think there's a lot further to go.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Within the last few hours, I've learnt that I have a constituent who lost her grandmother, who had recovered from successful hip surgery without the need for any drug interventions, and who was sent to Gosport War Memorial Hospital for rehabilitation, only to be given a lethal cocktail of drugs which killed her. The matter was reported to Gosport Police when it happened in 1998. So will the Secretary of State agree with me that if people are found willfully to have administered lethal drug doses unnecessarily, they deserve to lose their liberty? And if people are found willfully to have covered up these crimes, for that's what they are, they deserve to lose their jobs?
Secretary of State.
Well, I don't think anyone in this House wouldn't share my right honourable friend's sentiments, but we have to let the law take its course now, and we have to make sure that justice is done, and it has been denied for too long.
Mr. Stephen Morgan.
Speaker, may I thank on behalf of my constituents the Secretary of State for the apology and the statement in the House today. Could he confirm that all families affected have been contacted and say a bit more about the detail of the support that will be available for those that have lost loved ones? Thank you.
Secretary of State.
Yes, I'm happy to do that. I mean, all the families who think they had a relative affected have been part of the panel process, and they were all invited for a briefing by Bishop Jones this morning in Portsmouth. But we will be providing ongoing support and counselling, if necessary, through the Department of Health and Social Care going forward. That was a specific request by Bishop Jones. But we are also conscious that when people read the news, they may suddenly decide that they too, or a loved one, was affected by this. And so we've set up a helpline so that people can contact us, so we can help people trace whether they too could have been affected.
Sir Bernard Jenkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Doesn't every instance of hearing that people were scared to speak out, that relatives found it too difficult to complain, underline the importance of the Healthcare Safety Investigation Branch that he has established? And can I remind him that I am at this moment chairing the joint committee of both houses that is doing the pre-legislative scrutiny into this draft bill, and when we report on the 24th of July, will my right honourable friend undertake to bring this into law as quickly as possible, because that will afford the safe space that people need so that they can go and tell these things to people without fear or favour.
Secretary of State.
Well, absolutely, and I commend him for his work and for being one of the colleagues in this place who has thought about and talked about the importance of getting the right safety culture in the NHS as being absolutely critical going forward. Why does the Healthcare Safety Investigation Branch matter? Because in situations like this, they could have been called in and they could have done a totally independent investigation and got to the truth of what was happening quickly and prevented reoccurrence of the problem. And so that is one of a number of things that we need to think about going forward.
Stephen Lloyd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 10 years ago, a constituent came to see me called Mrs. Gillian Mackenzie. She told me a story that sounded so far-fetched, Mr. Speaker, I struggled to believe it. The story included that, in her opinion, her mother and many other elderly people had effectively been killed before their time at a hospital in Gosport. I found it staggering. I then read the hundreds of pages of documents that this amazing woman, Mrs. Mackenzie, had put together over the weekend, and I came to the harrowing conclusion that there just could be a chance of significant early death at the Gosport War Memorial. I was a candidate then, not the MP. I contacted my good friend, the MP for North Norfolk, and I took Mrs. Mackenzie and relatives up to London to meet my friend, the honourable member, and he agreed with me that this could be something wicked beyond compare. Over the next few years, continual campaigning, continual lobbying, continual pushback, finally, and I do pay tribute to my good friend, we got this commission off the ground. 20 years later, by the way, Mrs. Mackenzie, Mr. Speaker, is now 84. I saw her on Saturday evening, wished her luck and gave her a hug. 20 years later, Mr. Speaker, we are talking deaths of over 450, possibly 600 elderly people. The relatives today got the truth.
Order. I have the very highest respect for the honourable gentleman and for his keen interest in and experience of this issue, and I am exercising some latitude for backbenchers and for the Secretary of State on this extremely sober matter, but I hope that the honourable gentleman is at least approaching something that has a question mark at the end of it. Mr. Stephen Lloyd.
He is, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much, and I appreciate the latitude. It's been a 10-year battle. Today, the relatives got the truth. What I would ask the Secretary of State is I and the relatives demand justice. So I would urge that the House, the Government, the police do everything that is necessary to ensure that individuals named in the report are brought to justice.
Thank you. Secretary of State.
Well, there can be no justice unless the truth is put on the table, and that is the crucial first step, and now justice must proceed. But I just want to thank him for the campaigning he did for Mrs. Mackenzie, and perhaps the best words is this quote from the panel, which is a comment that they said in the report. Yes, we have listened, and yes, you, the families, were right. Your concerns have been shown to be valid.
Mr. Philip.
Done. Add my voice in tribute to the work of Bishop James Jones and the integrity and diligence that he and the panel have shown in conducting this inquiry. The Secretary of State has been quite right in focusing on the impact on families, and I was pleased to hear from his statement that there will be a helpline for those families who may not know that they've been affected but have the suspicion that they might, not least because the immediate catchment around Gosport includes a lot of retirement homes, and many families whose elderly relatives went to retire to the area may be living some distance away, and there may be a considerable number of people from the publicity given rise to by this report today who will need to get in touch. So could I ask him to ensure that this panel helpline is adequately resourced?
Yes, I'll absolutely do that, and I ought to say that I know that he met many families and relatives in his time as Minister in my department and always dealt with those cases with a huge amount of compassion. I mean, the facts of the matter are that there are, according to the report, 650 plus people whose lives were shortened, but we're only in touch with about 100 families. So we are expecting more people to come forward.
Diana Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I too want to join in with the comments that have been made about the remarkable work of Bishop James Jones, not only in this important report, but the work he did around Hillsborough and also the work he did last summer around mediating with the government about the moving of the contaminated blood inquiry away from the Department of Health. And I wanted to seek an assurance really from the Minister, the Secretary of State, about the approach that Bishop Jones puts forward, which is the families first approach, and whether there is now a commitment in government to making that the hallmark of any inquiry that's ever held in the future, families first.
Well, I think actions speak louder than words, and that's what he requested on this occasion, and we've done that. We obviously need to think through some process issues, because when a minister wants to report to the House, they need to be a little bit informed as to what they're talking about. And I think we found a way to do that with this report and the Francis report. So I think that's a good template.
Andrew Bridgen. Speaker, can I commend the diligence and determination of the Right Honourable Member for Norfolk North, without whose efforts we would not be hearing the truth today, as grim and disturbing as that truth might be. Does my right honourable friend agree with me? This asks further questions about the way in which doctors' performance and patient safety is monitored. Currently, with the GMC, it's effectively doctors policing themselves. Isn't it time that this system has to change?
Well, I think we do have to ask those questions, and we have to be able to answer concerns of him and his constituents about how we can be absolutely certain that there's not going to be a closing of ranks. My experience, though, is that doctors are very quick to want to remove those of their number who are letting the profession down, because it's damaging for everyone's reputation. But I think that there are some very difficult questions for the GMC and the NMC to answer in this report. Because their processes took so long, I don't think they can put their hand on their hearts and say they kept patients safe in that period.
Kevin Jones.
Thank you. The legislation regulating both doctors and other healthcare professionals is now 35 years old. It's inefficient, outdated, and I know from a case in my own constituency where an individual is into a 5th year of a complaint with the GMC, it is not user-friendly for the complainant. Now, the GMC and other healthcare professionals want change. His own department has already consulted on change. Can he give a guarantee that he'll bring forward legislation to actually ensure that the system is not only effective, but also effective for the patients who make complaints?
Well, he's absolutely right. We have a regulatory landscape that is very complex and doesn't achieve the results we want, and forces regulators to spend time doing things they don't want to do and not give them enough time for things they do want to do. Obviously, because of the parliamentary arithmetic, if we're able to get a parliamentary consensus on that change, then that would speed forward the legislation.
Helen Whately.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There are many if-onlys, but one if-only is if only the junior doctors and others who spoke up had been listened to. I know my right honourable friend is committed to making sure that people are listened to, that whistleblowers are listened to, and to transparency. Can he say a bit more about what he's doing to make sure that everyone involved in patient care, from consultants to healthcare assistants, porters, patients and families, are listened to and their concerns acted upon?
Well, I think we have made progress when it comes to whistleblowing, because every trust now has a freedom to speak up guardian who is an independent person inside the trust who clinicians can contact if they have patient safety concerns. And that is a big step forward. It's recommended by Robert Francis. Where I'm less clear that we have solved the problem is someone for families to go to if they think that everyone is closing ranks. And that's what I think we now need to reflect on.
Dr. Lisa Cameron.
Many thanks, Mr. Speaker, and I refer the House to my register and history of working in the NHS. A brave nurse came forward all those many years ago to highlight a concern. However, the concern was not taken forward adequately at that time. Often in these circumstances, the NHS closes ranks, management remove the individual who raises the concern, the clinician in this instance, and allows the system to continue. Is there some way of monitoring the types of concerns raised by clinicians and ensuring that the staff who raise these concerns are not penalised themselves, and that the system then takes accountability forward?
Secretary of State.
Well, she's absolutely right to raise that, and the nurse involved, Anita Tubritt, talks in the report about her concerns and the pressure that she was put under, and it was a brave thing to do. And when she reads the report, she'll also see that there were nurse auxiliaries, people who are not professionally trained clinicians, who also came forward with concerns, who were also worried about the impact it would have on their own career. And that's what we have got to stop, because whichever part of the UK, getting a culture where people can speak openly about patient safety issues is absolutely essential.
Dr. Andrew Murison.
Mr. Speaker, I was a junior doctor at the Royal Hospital Haslar in Gosport, which is just around the corner from the Gosport Memorial Hospital, and I know that hospital fairly well, and I know the people of Gosport will be as disappointed and distressed by this, since they very much value their community hospital. Does he agree with me there is an issue around the governance of smaller institutions? We've seen it in the past. And whilst in no way wishing to disparage the excellent work that community hospitals do, and which I've been a champion of for many, many years, will he look specifically at those pages in the report that may touch upon this, since there is an issue around governing and ensuring safety in small institutions, be that general practice or hospitals?
Secretary of State.
I actually think that is an excellent point, and we should definitely look at that, because big hospitals have clear lines of accountability, boards, chief executives. Often with community hospitals, they don't exist. There is no one who can say they are the boss of that trust, and so that is something we should look at.
Ruth Cadbury.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent's grandmother died in the Gosport War Memorial Hospital in November 1999, i.e. after concerns were being raised by families and staff at the hospital. Now, the family believed that her morphine dose was well above that needed for her reported pain. I'd like to thank the Health Secretary for the tone of his statement today, and also to Bishop Jones for the work he did with his inquiry. My question for the Secretary of State is, does he believe that this report shows a need for tightening the draft Health Service Safety Investigations Bill?
I don't want to. I thank her for her comments. I don't want to jump to a conclusion about what any changes as far as that bill is concerned, but we should definitely reflect on any legislative changes that might be needed as a result of this report, and that bill could be a very powerful vehicle for doing so.
Dr. Caroline Johnson.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Speaker. My honourable friend has mentioned trust, and as a doctor myself, I'm very aware and humbled by the fact that people come with their children to put their trust in me to look after them. When events such as this occur, trust can be shaken. It's important, therefore, that these things are dealt with quickly. In this case, this investigation has been going on for far too long since complaints were first received. What can my honourable friend do to reassure people that in future any such complaints will be dealt with much more quickly and opportunities will not be lost to save lives in the meantime?
Well, that is the big question that we have to answer both to this House and to the British people. But I would say to her that I am confident that where there is unsafe practice, it is surfaced much more quickly now in the NHS than it has been in the past. What I'm less confident about is whether we've removed the bureaucratic obstacles that mean the processes of doing these investigations aren't delayed inordinately long, so that the broader lessons that need to be learned can be.
Andrew Selous.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. One of the reasons for the growing success of the Getting It Right First Time programme is the creation of clinician-agreed data sets. Can the Secretary of State give the House assurance that in future there will be proper analysis of the data of the excess number of deaths, the use of this particular type of drug in excessive amounts, which would have shown this hospital as an outlier, so questions could have been asked, as is happening now successfully with the GIRFT programme?
Well, I thank him for his championing of the GIRFT programme, which is an incredibly powerful and successful programme. And he will have noticed that last week we announced that we are expanding into a national clinical information programme which will cover more than 70% of consultants. I think what is disturbing in this case, though, if I may say, is that the data was really around mortality, and we actually have had that data for this whole period. So there is really nothing to stop anyone looking at data, and you can see a spike in the mortality rates in this hospital between 1997 and 2001. It goes down dramatically in 2001 when the practices around opiates were changed. And that's why we've got to ask ourselves this very difficult question about why no one looked at that data, or if they did, why no one did anything about it.
Robert Courts. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the Secretary of State commit to look at the wider structural issues that affect patient safety, in particular things like staffing levels and pressures on doctors and nurses?
Secretary of State. Absolutely. And I think one of the big lessons from this report is we have to look at systemic issues as much as the practice of an individual doctor or nurse.
Alex Burghardt.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I congratulate the Secretary of State and the Honourable Member for North Norfolk getting us to this point. And I was deeply concerned to hear in his statement that ministers had been given advice not to proceed with this independent panel. Is the Secretary of State convinced that ministers are now receiving better advice?
Secretary of State.
Of course, that's an issue that we will look into. I would just say, in the interest of transparency, I think the Department of Health has been on the same journey that the whole of the rest of the NHS has been on with respect to patient safety issues.
Eddie Hughes. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Secretary of State agree that this report highlights the importance of the CQC to the NHS and patient safety, and will he consider giving that body greater regulatory powers?
Well, I think the legal independence of the CQC and their ability, if you like, to act as the nation's whistleblower-in-chief is one of the big important reforms of recent years, and I think that will give the public confidence. But I don't think that's the entire answer, and I still think there's an issue about who families go to when they think they're being ignored by the establishment.
Mr. Andrew Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've had mid-staffs, Morecambe Bay, and now the Gosport War Memorial Hospital. That tells us that significant patient failures are not one-offs. And indeed, I think the Francis report of 2013 was one of the most challenging public documents I have ever read. So, my right honourable friend has made patient safety a personal priority for him with his customary judgment and compassion. Can he confirm that this developing culture within the NHS remains a priority for them, and that it will do all it can to protect the most frail and vulnerable that it looks after?
That is absolutely my priority, and he worked very closely with me on that when he was my PPS. And I would just say that changing culture is a long, long process, but I think we can start by some of the things we do in this House and reacting afresh to this report, and not just saying we've done what we need to do because we have mid-staffs in Morecambe Bay, is a very important next step.
Mr. Philip Hollowbone.
For me, the two most shocking things are the number of deaths and the length of time it has taken for this scandal to be exposed. Further to the earlier question, until he overruled it, the official advice from the Department of Health was that this public inquiry should not take place. Is there going to be an official investigation into why that official advice was given and which civil servant should be held accountable for it?
We will, of course, look at that, and that's why I said in my statement that there were failures by the Department of Health. That specific instance needs to be looked at, but also as the steward of the system where so many other things went wrong.
Nigel Huddleston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Secretary of State confirm that all deaths in the NHS will be properly assessed by a coroner or a medical examiner so that lessons can be learned and avoidable deaths minimised?
I can confirm from next April all hospital deaths will be examined by an independent doctor. It's the medical examiner process, and we're expanding the Learning from Breaths programme to primary care. So that's exactly where we want to go.
Sorry. Thank you. Point of order, Mr. Martin Doherty-Hughes.
Mr. Speaker, this month is Gypsy Traveller Roma History Month. Yet as we celebrate the distinct and important contribution of our Gypsy Traveller and Roma community and ancient history across these islands, one of our closest allies, through the office of the Foreign Minister for the Republic of Italy, is systematically targeting the Roma community of Italy. Could you advise the House how this place can express its utter dismay that one of our close allies is targeting one of Europe's most distinct communities and one of its most vulnerable in such a heinous fashion?
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his point of order and for his characteristic courtesy in giving me advance notice that he wished to put it. The matter will be of concern to honourable and right honourable members across the House. The honourable gentleman will recall that the matter was raised earlier in questions to the Prime Minister. I'm confident that members of this House, the honourable gentleman included, will continue to find ways to express their opposition to these developments and, as they think fit, and if appropriate, to press the government for action or representations on the matter. More specifically, insofar as the honourable gentleman in his point of order enquired what a member could do to flag up concern, the answer is, beyond statements in the chamber and the opportunities that might be presented by debate, honourable members are perfectly at liberty to table and sign early day motions. So I think the honourable gentleman will require no further information or encouragement than I have already provided. Point of order, Alison Thewlis.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, last Wednesday, in a debate that I called in Westminster Hall, the Minister for Immigration responded on the Home Office's treatment of highly skilled migrants by saying that, and I quote, "No applicants have been successful at judicial review," and also that 38 appeals have been allowed, mostly on human rights grounds. Mr Speaker, firstly, my understanding is that appeals can only be allowed on human rights grounds under Section 6 of the Human Rights Act. But more worryingly, several different sources have been in touch with me, Mr Speaker, to say that people have been successful at judicial review, either because the Home Office decision has been overturned or because the Home Office settled via consent order and then granted indefinite leave to remain afterwards. Mr Speaker, I'm very concerned that the Minister for Immigration has misled the House in Westminster Hall, either through omission or through deliberate misuse of a statement. Would she be able to bring this to the House?
Order. The honourable lady mustn't suggest that a minister has, by calculation, misled either this chamber or Westminster Hall. If she wants to suggest that there might have been inadvertence involved, that would be orderly, and then she can conclude very safely her point of order, and I think that would be best. Please.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. The Minister may have inadvertently misled the House, Mr Speaker, but she certainly read from a pre-prepared statement to Westminster Hall, as far as I could ascertain. So I think it would be useful if the Minister could come to the House and explain this statement that she made last week, because it is deeply concerning that people have quite clearly won at judicial review, and the Minister either does not know that or did not share that with the House.
Well, I'm very grateful to the honourable lady for her point of order, and the short answer is that every member of this House is responsible for the veracity of what he or she says to it. That includes ministers. If a minister feels that he or she has erred, and to err is human, and has inadvertently given incorrect information to the House, it is open to, and it would, I think, be thought incumbent upon, that member to correct the record. It is not for me to act as arbiter of whether that is required, but the honourable lady, who is now a relatively experienced and certainly a very dexterous member of the House, has found the means to register her concern. I feel sure that that concern will be communicated to the relevant occupant of the Treasury bench ere long. What then happens? We await events. If there are no further... Yes, I'm coming to that. Yes, indeed. Yes. I was simply going to say, I'm extremely grateful to the clerk, who's very on the ball as always, for his procedural expertise. I was just going to say, if there are no further points of order, no further points of order on other matters, we come now to the point of order from Mr. Craig McKinley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to make an apology to the House. In 2001, some 17 years ago, I incorporated a company with name Mama Airlines Limited on the back of a business idea, that of the potential for a low-cost airline with Manston to Malaga a possible route. The company has never traded, has never had a bank account, and has 2 pence of share capital that I own. That is the entirety of its balance sheet. I have never received a reward or remuneration of any kind. It was an idea of its day, and following the tragedy of 9/11, never came to anything and plans ceased. It remains a dormant company, and for me personally, I have never had any subsequent thoughts of creating an airline, nor of using the registered company for any other activity. I had not considered, under any common sense interpretation of the rules, that such a shareholding of 2 pence in a dormant company that has never traded would require registration under the Register of Members' Interests. Shame. I was wrong to rely on common sense, as there is no de minimis value threshold once the 15% shareholding limit has been reached. This business idea is no secret, Mr. Speaker. I mention the fact with some pride on public platforms, in the local press, in election literature, and to whoever will listen. I'd be very surprised if there was anyone in South Thanet unaware of this long-past business idea. Not surprisingly, Manston Airport is a relevant local issue, and I will continue to speak up for an aviation future for Manston, which would bring with it jobs and investment to East Kent. The registration of my interest will now be recorded appropriately in my personal register of interest for the House under the rectification procedure. The interest should have been registered from 8th of May 2015. Given the registrable interest, it also becomes a declarable one. It would now appear under the rules that my shareholding in a dormant company with no assets and certainly no aircraft makes me the ongoing owner of a quite unique airline that is never going to fly. I identify, Mr. Speaker, 2 occasions when a declaration might reasonably have been made. I should have prefaced my speeches on the 28th of May 2015 and 11th of June 2015 with a declaration that I hold 2 pence worth of shares in the dormant company. I most sincerely apologise to the House for my error and oversight. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I thank the honourable gentleman for the apology that he has given to the House, and, if I may say so, for the good humour that he has displayed in the course of making that statement. I think it is acknowledged and accepted by the House. Point of order, Mr. Ben Bradshaw.
Mr. Speaker, have you been made aware of reports in the last few minutes that seriously sick Labour members of this House are going to be prevented from voting this afternoon, potentially, because of government whips breaking with the usual convention of allowing them to be nodded through? This would constitute a serious breach of this House's conventions, and I would be grateful if you could make a ruling so that the government whips can hear it.
Well, I'm very grateful to the right honourable gentleman for his point of order. The short answer is that I had heard nothing of that until the right honourable gentleman just sidled up to the chair and mentioned it. That practice has long taken place on the basis of cooperation between the usual channels. So there's nothing unusual about that arrangement. It is very long established and commonplace, but it doesn't bear upon or speak to the functions of the chair. It is a matter that has to be agreed between the different sides of the House. But the right honourable gentleman is a very experienced member of this House, and he has registered with some force and alacrity his strength of feeling on the matter.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
Point of order, Mr. David T.C. Davis.
Mr. Speaker, is it in order for former members of the House of Parliament to take a seat at the Conservative table in the tea room and plot against the government that they were once a part of? Wouldn't those members be better off tending to their moats?
Well, I mean, what I say to the honourable gentleman is that who turns up at which table and says what to whom in the tea room might be a matter, perhaps, for the administration committee, and the honourable gentleman is himself an experienced denizen of the House, could potentially raise it with advantage with his honourable friend, the member for Mole Valley, who is not merely a distinguished ornament of that committee, but who in fact chairs it. However, I think, as the honourable gentleman knows, I'm not myself these days in the habit of going into the tea room, and I am not privy to these matters, but the honourable gentleman's raised his point in his own delightfully understated way with which members in all parts of the House are well familiar. If there are at this stage no further points of order, we come to the presentation of bill in the name of Mr. Sajid Javid, the Home Secretary. A Minister nods. The Minister has nodded.
Offensive Weapons Bill.
Second reading what day?
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow. Thank you. Order. We now come, colleagues, to the 10-minute rule motion. Mr. Martin Doherty-Hughes.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that leave be given to bring a bill to create a statutory staff association to seek to improve working and economic conditions for Her Majesty's Armed Forces as an employer and for connected purposes. Mr. Speaker, in a week in which there has been much division and rancor in this place, I'm glad to say that in one area in which we reliably gain broad consensus is when we talk about the services rendered by those who serve in our armed forces. Not only in the way in which they willingly put themselves in harm's way in order to protect that which we hold dear, but the way in which this service fundamentally shapes anyone's life, dictating where personnel live and how often they move, and ultimately how often they can see those they love. It is a sacrifice too few of the population understand. If I'm being honest, Mr. Speaker, serving in the armed forces is a choice that many do not consider because of this immense sacrifice. I include myself in that category. Even if it has been proven an effective route for advancement for diminutive working-class boys from the west of Scotland like myself. But I do come from a services family. My father, a Royal Engineer, just like my nephew, and my brother beginning in the Highland Light Infantry, the 152 Lowland Battalion, before ending up in 6th Scots, where he currently serves. And if there had been one thing that I had noticed, it is the anomaly that between those among family and friends who put themselves in harm's way wearing, say, an army uniform, and those who put themselves in harm's way wearing a police or fire brigade uniform. Put a hero in a uniform and call them police or firefighter, and they have a professional body or trade union to represent their interests. Put them in an Army, Navy or Royal Air Force uniform, and they do not. I cannot for the life of me see why. Similarly, as we talk of these public servants in such heroic terms, we often forget that they are also normal employees with almost the same rights as anyone else. Let me be clear for all the honourable and I would hope honourable and gallant members here today. This bill, honouring a commitment in my own party's manifesto, which seeks to create an armed forces representative body on a statutory footing, just like the police federation we have in each of the nations of these islands. Crucially, just like the police federation, it will not have power to strike, and thus it would not be appropriate to call it a trade union. But I consider this to be very much one major missing piece in the ongoing struggle for the rights of employees, albeit one that I believe the front benches of both the Conservative and Labour parties have not deemed important enough to consider throughout any of the periods they have had in government. I can only hope that they would follow the Scottish National Party's lead here today and support this bill. Though I do salute, Mr. Speaker, the honourable member for North Durham, who I spoke to earlier on, who presented a private member's bill nearly 10 years ago. Quite simply, the armed forces can speak with one voice, all 194,140 of them. Then that voice will be one that the government of any day will have to listen to, and improved economic and working conditions will follow. The current status quo is failing service personnel, and ultimately the relatively weak position the disparate stakeholders find themselves in is not working in their favour. Of course, serving personnel may join trade unions or professional associations linked to the work that they do, along with sectional groups that specifically represent their interests inside the armed forces. And we know that the work of the Independent Armed Forces Pay Review Body and Service Complaints Ombudsman is always welcomed. We also know that those in main building have often found it too easy to disregard their findings. And while the excellent work of the Service Families Charity had an interesting meeting with the Naval Families Federation in my constituency office last Friday, along with others such as SAFA, Poppy Scotland and many others, are diligent, determined champions for those in the armed forces community, I cannot help but conclude that their excellent work is no substitute, Mr. Speaker, for a united organisation whose single, unambiguous duty is to its members and only its members. And while there is a British Armed Forces Federation, it does not have the level of recognition from the government as similar bodies elsewhere. It's actually an arrangement that is not so unusual among the small northern European states in our neighbourhood, along with Germany and Australia. Ireland, Norway, Denmark, Sweden and the Netherlands all have different forms of armed forces representative bodies, some of which are trade unions, some of which are more informal, but nonetheless recognised negotiating or welfare bodies. It may have been some of these examples, Mr. Speaker, that provoked some of the criticism of this bill when it was written about in the Sunday Post last weekend. And while I expected the usual nonsense about representation and advocacy somehow leading towards a permanent decline in standards and discipline, I was astonished at some of the bad faith arguments by those who would consider themselves experts in defence and security. So let me be clear again to anyone who would seek to block this bill by saying that all that it is needed to secure better pay and conditions for those in the armed services is some more money from the Treasury and goodwill from the main building. They aren't living in the real world. The personnel challenges faced by the Ministry of Defence are not insignificant, and to be fair, nor has their pecuniary response been, with some £664 million being spent over the last 5 years on recruitment and retention initiatives. And so I would hope better representation and better prospects for those thinking of enlisting would help drive this figure down. The recent NAO report into overcome what now amounts to skilled personnel shortfall of 5.7% overall and significantly more in the pinch point trades makes for eye-opening reading, and ultimately concludes that the current settlement is not sustainable, particularly when skilled force personnel can make far more on Civvy Street. This is a situation which will only be exacerbated as the skills expected of personnel move into the next generation of cyber and electronic warfare. In the real world, the armed forces must be able to compete with the tech start-ups. But the most compelling argument, Mr. Speaker, for an armed forces representative body does not come from looking to the future, but from looking at history. While much attention in the Chilcot report ultimately focused on the decision to go to war and the intelligence used, for many of those who served, their and most damning sections came near the end, when the failures in personnel and equipment planning came to the fore. For those of us like me, whose loved ones served in the conflict, and more for those, some here who may be here today in the chamber, who were there, we have to wonder why it took so long for the government to take action to address these programmes, even though we know so many raised concerns through the chain of command. I leave everyone here to draw their own conclusions, Mr. Speaker, as to whether the government would have been slow to react to personnel speaking with one strong voice. If we consider that the end of UK operations in Iraq and Afghanistan also dovetailed with the beginning of austerity, pay freezes and the swinging cuts to our military that it has entailed, it is no surprise that there has been an adverse effect on the morale of those who serve. Indeed, it is no surprise that last month's continuous attitude survey saw overall happiness in the armed forces continue to fall. But there's a disconnect, Mr. Speaker, somewhere, because we all know there has been so much done in recent years to improve public perceptions of serving personnel, to make Armed Forces Day more prominent, or to make it easier for personnel to make a transition to civilian life. As I come to a close, Mr. Speaker, let me post a theory. Those who serve in our armed forces do so for a variety of reasons. I'm fairly sure that being a hero isn't usually one of them. There's more to government fetishisms, the idea of heroic sacrifice, while failing in its basic obligations on pay
and conditions, the lower morale will fall. For those who served need not platitudes from well-meaning politicians, but for their basic rights to be done right, to be paid, clothed and housed properly, to be supported and nurtured throughout their career, and to be able to deal with an employer that knows that if it does not meet its obligations, it will face 194,140 people speaking with one strong voice.
Thank you. The question is that the honourable member have leave to bring in the bill. Mr Philip Dunn.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I am grateful to you for allowing me to rise to oppose this bill. For although I share many of the sentiments expressed by the honourable member for West Dunbartonshire when introducing his bill, I have to say that I don't recognise the complaint that he is seeking to address. Having spent time in the Ministry of Defence, admittedly not in the personnel role, but having met countless serving personnel across all services at all levels, not once in the nearly 4 years that I spent at the Ministry of Defence did anybody ever suggest to me that a remedy for some of the natural complaints that serving personnel have from time to time would be the creation of a trade union or a staff association. And one of the reasons why nobody raised this as an issue that I was aware of is, of course, because there already are, as he touched on in his remarks, a plethora of existing families federations across each of the services which do a very good job and exist in order to advocate on behalf of forces personnel and their families some of the very issues that he's trying to address through this bill. Welfare of serving personnel is the top issue that they seek to contend with, and accommodation is another issue which is always high on their list, and it is well acknowledged by service chiefs, by the Ministry of Defence, by the Defence Infrastructure Organisation that has responsibility for military quarters, that a considerable amount of work needs to be done, and there is a persistent investment in the military estate, trying to bring up to contemporary standards some of the historic garrison accommodation, some of which is not only decades old, it goes back over 100 years, and that is something which the Secretary of State is committed to trying to resolve and is working through the families federations to do so. In addition to the families federations, there are, of course, the plethora of charities that support serving personnel and in particular support veterans. The honourable gentleman may or may not be aware that there are over 400 service-facing charities right up and down this country helping veterans when they leave the service. And the work, I'd like to pay tribute, Mr Speaker, if I may, to the work of COBSEO, which is the organisation which acts as an umbrella for these charity groups, who provide a signposting service for serving personnel as they seek to find their new career and come out of the armed forces once they've served their tour of duty, to identify the areas where they might need help and support, much of the kind of work which I would envisage his putative staff association might be able to do. And it would be nothing short of confusing to add another tier of advice and support through the body that he is proposing, because one of the biggest challenges when you, as a service leaver, you decide you need some support for a particular direction, whether it's to find employment, to find housing, to find medical care, is where do you turn to? And that's why the existing structure of COBSEO does such a great job. In addition to that, there is also the Veterans Gateway, which is an online capacity, I believe funded by the Ministry of Defence, which provides, again, an online ability for individuals to look to find the right organisation to support them. I have to ask the honourable gentleman, because it wasn't clear from his remarks, what remedy he is trying to right with this. Probably what wrong is he trying to right?
if he's looking for a voice for serving personnel, as he indicated, these do exist with the families' federations. If he's looking to find access to represent personnel through the chain of command, that's what the chain of command is there for. The charities that support personnel, in addition, have continuous access to the chain of command, to the civil servants in the MOD and supporting each of the services, and have access directly to ministers through regular dialogue with the minister, my honourable friend, right honourable friend, who's sitting on the front bench today. The honourable gentleman speaks frequently on military matters on behalf of his party, and there is broad agreement, I think, across the House from all parties that we wish to provide for our serving personnel the highest possible standards of welfare, of pay, to recruit and retain the armed forces that we need to keep this country safe. And nobody would doubt the commitment of this side of the House, and frankly I don't doubt the commitment of the honourable gentleman to meet that objective. But what I would say to him gently is that if he really wants to do the right thing for the personnel who serve in Scotland, he should ask his colleagues in the Scottish Government to think very carefully about whether it will help to recruit and retain experienced military personnel by putting up their income tax simply to have the pleasure of serving in Scotland. And I say to the honourable gentleman that that is a more significant and material measure which will lead to potential damage to the armed forces in Scotland, and he would do well to think that again rather than to press this bill. Mr. Speaker, I will not press this to a division, but I hope the House has heard the strength of concern that I have, and I know is shared by others on these benches.
Order. The question is that the honourable member have leave to bring in the bill. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Who will prepare and bring in the bill?
Ian Blackford, Liz Saville-Roberts, Carol Monaghan, Stuart Malcolm MacDonald, Douglas Chapman, Angela Crawley, Stephen Gethens, Stuart Hosey, Chris Law, Angus Brendan McNeill and Pete Wishart, and myself.
Mr. Martin Doherty Hughes.
Armed Forces Representative Body Bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday, November 23rd.
Friday, November the 23rd. Thank you. Order. We come now to the programme motion to be moved formally by the Secretary of State for exiting the European Union. Thank you. The question is as on the order paper. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order. The clerk will now proceed to read the orders of the day.
European Union Withdrawal Bill. Consideration of Lord's message.
Now. Thank you. Order. We begin with the government motion to agree to Lord's Amendments 19C to 19E, 19G to 19L, and 19P, and to propose amendments to Lord's Amendment 19P. With this, we will consider all the remaining Lord's amendments as listed on the selection paper. I inform the House that I have selected Manuscript Amendment B in the name of Mr. Dominic Grieve, and Amendment A in the name of Mr. Tom Brake. I would add, for the convenience of the House, that copies of Manuscript Amendment B are available in the vote office. I call to move the motion the Secretary of State for exiting the European Union, Secretary David Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will turn in a moment to the issue which will be at the forefront of many honourable members' minds. That is Parliament's role at the conclusion of the negotiations with the European Union. But first I want to set out the other issues which are before the House for approval today. These are all issues where the Lords agreed with the Government on Monday. That is, enhanced protection of certain areas of EU law, family reunification for refugee children, and extending sifting arrangements for SIs to the Lords. The Government set out common sense approaches to these three issues in the Lords, who backed the Government, and the issues now return to this House for final approval. The fourth issue is, as I have said, Parliament's role at the conclusion of our negotiations with the European Union. Before we turn to the detail, let us take a step back for a moment and consider the long democratic process we've been on to get here. It began with the European Union Referendum Act, passed by a majority of 263 in this House, and at which point the Government was clear it would respect the outcome of the referendum, followed by the referendum itself, which saw a turnout of over 33 million people. 17.4 million people voted in favour of leaving the European Union. We then had the European Union Notification of Withdrawal Bill, which empowered the Government to trigger Article 50, and despite the attempts of some in the other place to impugn the validity of this notification, that bill also passed both houses with a majority of 372, in this place voting for third reading. This was followed by a general election where both major parties, attracting over 80% of the vote, stood on manifestos which committed to respecting the result of the referendum. 27.5 million votes for parties that said they would respect the referendum. No ifs, no buts. And while we're now in the process of passing this essential bill to get our statute book ready for the day we leave, it will ensure we respect the referendum result, but exit the European Union in as smooth and orderly manner as possible. We've already set out in law that this process will be followed by a motion to approve the final deal we agree with the European Union in negotiations. If this is supported by Parliament, and I hope and expect it will be, the Government will introduce the Withdrawal Agreement and Implementation Bill, which Parliament will have time to debate, vote on and amend if they so wish. Finally, as with any international treaty, the withdrawal agreement will be subject to the approval and ratification procedures under the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act 2010. And this is all before we even consider the other pieces of legislation we have and will pass as a part of this process. So anyone who questions the democratic credentials of the Government or of this process should consider the steps that we have taken to get to this stage and those which we have already laid out in front of us. I believe they're greater than any steps taken for any international negotiation ever in the history of this country. Now, furthermore to that, to what was said in the other place on Monday, this gives Parliament significantly more rights than we see on the European Union side. The European Parliament simply has to consent to the withdrawal agreement, a yes or no vote, and the EU member states will simply have a vote in Council on the withdrawal agreement. So we have considerably more powers than them too. Now let me now turn to the detail of the amendment at hand. We start with a simple purpose. How do we guarantee Parliament's role in scrutinising the Government in the unlikely event that the preferred scenario does not come to pass? Our intention is straightforward: to conclude negotiations later this year and put before both houses a deal that's worthy of support. In approaching our discussions on this matter, the Government set out three reasonable tests. They are that we do not undermine the negotiations, we do not alter the constitutional role of Parliament in relation to international negotiations, and we respect the result of the referendum. It's on this basis that we have tabled our amendment in lieu. It's a fair and serious proposal which demonstrates the significant flexibility that the Government has already shown in addressing the concerns of this House. Our original amendment provided that if Parliament rejects the final deal, the Government must make a statement setting out its next steps in relation to negotiations within 28 days of that rejection. Our new amendment now provides for a statement and a motion, ensuring there's a guaranteed opportunity for both houses to express their views on the Government's proposed next steps. Not only that, but we've also expanded the set of circumstances in which that opportunity would arise to cover the three situations conceived of by my right honourable and learned friend, the member for Beaconsfield amendment last week. Firstly, if Parliament rejects the deal, A statement must now be made within 21 days, and a motion must be tabled in both houses within 7 sitting days of that statement. Alternatively, if the Prime Minister announces before the 21st of January 2019 that no deal can be agreed with the European Union, a statement must be made within 14 days, and a motion must be tabled in both houses within 7 days of that statement. Finally, if no agreement has been reached by the end of the 21st of January 2019, a statement must be made within 5 days, and a motion must be tabled in both houses within 5 sitting days. That would happen whatever the state of negotiations at that stage. I will give way to the Chairman of the Brexit Committee.
When he recently appeared before the Select Committee, the Right Honourable Gentleman confirmed that the motion asking the House to approve the withdrawal agreement would be amendable. Can he therefore explain to the House why the Government is now proposing amendments to the Lord's Amendment to include the reference to neutral terms, when the Right Honourable Gentleman will be very well aware that Standing Order 24B of the House says that if a motion is considered by Mr. Speaker to be in neutral terms, then it cannot be amended. Why is the Government prepared to allow an amendable motion in one case, but not in the dire circumstances that he is now describing?
Well, he prefaced it perfectly with the rest of my speech, because that's precisely what I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes explaining to him. Now, the point where we're at there is that the initial provisions speak for themselves. Our proposed amendment creates a formal structure set out in law for Parliament to express its views in all of the various scenarios that might come to pass in our exit from the European Union. But it also, not for the moment, but it also passes 3 tests set out by myself and the Prime Minister. Now, I'm glad to see that the amendment sent back to us by the other place accepts the vast majority of these provisions. The core of the disagreement now focuses on the exact nature of the motion offered to the House if any of the unfortunate circumstances I previously mentioned come to pass. Our amendment offers those motions in neutral terms. Questions have focused understandably on whether that means they would not be amendable. Honourable members will of course be aware it's not within the competence of government to judge whether amendments can be tabled to motions. But for clarity, I quote from Standing Order 24B of the House of Commons, which states, "Where, in the opinion of the Speaker of the Chair, a motion that this House has considered the matter is expressed in neutral terms, no amendments to it may be tabled." I've written to the Chairman of the Procedure Committee setting out how the Government understands this process will operate in practice, and I've laid a copy of that letter in the libraries of both Houses. I give way to the Honourable Lady.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm enormously grateful to the Secretary of State for allowing me to make an intervention in this early part of his contribution, this important contribution this afternoon. I really am most unhappy with the repetition by the Prime Minister and others in government with this mantra, no deal is better than a bad deal. So I would like the Secretary of State to give a guarantee to the people of Northern Ireland that the government that he represents here today will not be gambling with the constitutional status of Northern Ireland as an integral part of the United Kingdom, because no deal would lead to a hard border which would be inevitably exploited by Sinn Féin and by new IRA dissidents. I need that guarantee.
You should be quite sure we won't be gambling with the status of the border, and I'll come back to the issue of no deal in a moment, because that is central to much of the issue of the amendability of motions. I will give way to my honourable friend first, and then my right honourable friend second.
Isn't the importance, I suggest to my right honourable friend, isn't the importance of the position that the government is taking, is that if a no-deal option is ruled out, it guarantees a worse deal in any negotiation. Anyone who has been party to a negotiation will understand that.
Yes. Well, he is right, and it's a point I'm going to come back to in a second. I give way to my right honourable friend.
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way. In the satisfactory amendment that left the House of Lords, the government would be obliged to put forward a substantive motion if its agreement was to be rejected. No doubt it would draft that with a view to commanding the majority of the House, but other people could put forward a substantive amendment with alternative proposals as to how to proceed. Now, he rejects that, and he's trying to replace it with a situation where the government doesn't have to put anything in its Second Amendment except that it takes note. And then, if anybody tries to put a substantial motion forward as an amendment, I'll give you £1 to a penny, Mr. Speaker, that the argument will be faced, if you pass this, it'll just mean no deal, because the government's not going to negotiate this, and it'll bring the thing to an end. And I cannot for the life of me see why the government is hesitating about the Lord's Amendment, except, of course, that it's come under tremendous pressure from hardline Brexiteers under the government, who caused the government to reject the perfectly satisfactory understanding that had been reached with honourable members on this side who had doubts last week.
Well, I'm afraid I don't agree with my right honourable friend. He will be unsurprised to hear. I don't try and follow him down the path of what might happen under what circumstances. I will explain in a moment. I will explain in a moment, Mr. Speaker. I will explain in a moment the reasoning behind the restriction of amendment, which is precisely accurate about this in this area. But I do not follow him down his path, and I say to him this: he has been in the House even longer than me, and he knows full well that very often, when the matters are very important, the procedural mechanism of the motion doesn't actually determine its power or its effect. Going right back to the Norway debate, which was on an adjournment motion put down by the Chief Whip of the day and changed the course of the war. So I don't take his point at all. Now, the amendment sent to us by the other place does not offer those motions in neutral terms. It's therefore possible, indeed I would predict likely, that wide-ranging amendments will be tabled which would seek to instruct the government on how to proceed in relation to our European Union withdrawal. Now, this might seem like a minor point of procedure, but it's integral to the nature of those motions and whether they pass the three tests I set out last week. Now, these debates and amendments in the last week have revolved around what happened in the event of no deal. And I say to the chairman of the Brexit Committee, the distinction between the motion that we promised the House, and I think I first promised him right back in the Article 50 debate, is it comes about if the House rejects the circumstances of a deal. These others apply principally to the issue of no deal, and that's really rather different. Now, let me be clear, and this is in response to the Honourable Lady. I have never argued in favour of no deal. I do not favour no deal. I will do what I can to avoid no deal. It's not an outcome we are seeking. As it stands, I am confident we will achieve a deal which this Parliament can support, as it stands. But you cannot enter a negotiation. You cannot enter the negotiation without a right to walk away. If you do, it rapidly ceases to be a negotiation. So the Lord's Amendment undermines the strength of the United Kingdom in negotiations. Now, there are plenty of voices on the European side of negotiations who seek to punish us, let's be very clear, and to do us harm, who wish to present us an unambiguously bad deal. Some to dissuade others from following us, and others who would do so with the intention of reversing the referendum or making us lose our nerve and rejoin the European Union. If it undermines the UK's ability to walk away, this amendment makes this outcome more likely. This is the paradox. I'll give away 1 second. This is the paradox. In trying to head off no deal, and it's important to the Honourable Lady too, in trying to head off no deal, you actually make no deal more likely, and that's what we're trying to avoid. I'll give away to one more thing.
My right honourable friend agree that where we have members on the opposite benches whose constituencies, like mine in Stoke-on-Trent South, voted strongly to leave, that we must ensure that they vote with us and vote to stop these amendments here tonight.
Well, I take his point, but I've always at this dispatch box and elsewhere insisted that people vote with their consciences, and that conscience should encompass how they represent the wishes of their constituents. Now, if the European Union expect Parliament to direct the government to reconsider its policies, to extend Article 50 or even to revoke it, they'll have an incentive to delay and give us the worst possible deal just to try to make such an outcome happen. I'm not going to be away for the moment, Mr. Speaker, so I hope you'll take that on board. This is already clear from the European Union's approach so far in some areas of negotiations. We've seen their inflexibility in their approach to Galileo. We've even seen it yesterday in their inflexibility in their approach to internal security generally. Furthermore, we have seen it firsthand, my team and I, whenever something happens in the Commons or the Lords that increases uncertainty, negotiations slow down. When they believe we might be forced to change our position to suit them, they stall. We cannot allow such an approach to become commonplace across all negotiations. Now, while I'm glad that we have moved away from the proposition that Parliament can give unilateral, wide-ranging, legally binding instructions to the government in international matters, an amendable motion nevertheless counts as a situation in which Parliament can direct the government on how it should proceed. There is a clear difference between government taking Parliament's view into account as expressed through a debate and Parliament instructing the government how to act. That difference is reflected in the two amendments on offer today. Finally, the amendment by the other place could be used to undermine the result of the referendum. The noble Viscount Lord Hailsham willingly admits he believes the decision of the British people in 2016 was, in his words, a national calamity. Lord Billamora spoke in terms previously when he described it as a no-Brexit amendment. This amendment is consistent with our belief. It sets out in law a clear path to follow those who wish to frustrate the withdrawal from the European Union. Our amendment, on the other hand, is consistent with the notion that it's right for Parliament... in a second. It is right for Parliament to express its view, but not to instruct the government on how to conduct itself in an international negotiation. As I have said, it passes the three tests set out by myself and the Prime Minister. I'll give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
Just before I come to the intervention, point of order. I hope it isn't a point of frustration. Mr. Paul Farrelly.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm reading here in the media for the first time a ministerial statement from the Secretary of State purporting to explain how neutral terms would operate in practice, and I assume that you've seen the statement, Mr. Speaker. It says, under the standing orders of the House of Commons, it will be for the Speaker to determine whether a motion, when it's introduced by the government under the European Union Withdrawal Bill, is or is not in fact cast in neutral terms, and hence whether the motion is or is not amendable. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, my question to you is what discretion does that leave you in practice if such a motion is cast in time-honoured neutral terms in the first place?
The discretion that I've always had in such circumstances is the short answer to the honourable gentleman. This matter may or may not be treated of further at a later point in our proceedings, but I don't want to detract from the time available for the debate. I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman. And I think the Secretary of State had given way to his honourable friend, the member for Shipley. Mr. Philip Davis.
I'm very grateful. Would my right honourable friend commend our honourable friend, the member for Bracknell, who on the radio today, with his characteristic openness, said that he hoped that if our right honourable and learned friend's amendment was passed today, he hoped that the House would use that in order to suspend Article 50 being triggered, which actually let the cat out of the bag of what the motive is, which is to delay, frustrate or even stop altogether the UK leaving the European Union.
Mr. Speaker, as I've said throughout this, it's for people to go with their consciences on this matter, and I don't attack anybody for doing that. May I just pick up on the point of order that was raised with you? Because I would not want the House to think that in any way they had not been told about this. Because in my speech earlier, I outlined the issue of the Erskine May on this matter, Standing Order 24B, and your rights in this, and made it plain that that's what we're relying upon. So I wouldn't want the House to be misled in any way, that, or believe they've been misled. Now, Mr. Speaker, debates on this issue have been the finest traditions of this House. Honourable members have stood on issues of principle, argued their cases with the utmost integrity. It shifted the government's approach to a position where our Parliament will rightly and unquestionably have its say and express its view. For in this, the greatest democracy of all, we debate, we argue, we make our cases with passion, but we do it to a purpose, and that is to deliver for our people, not just to please ourselves. They decided we'll leave the European Union, and whatever the European Union think about that, we'll do it, and we'll do it the best way we can. And in that spirit, I commend this motion to the House. I beg to...
Order! The question is that this House agrees with the Lords in their amendments 19C to 19E, 19G to 19L and 19P, and proposes the amendments to Lord's Amendment 19P as on the amendment paper. Sir Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak in favour of the amendment tabled by the Right Honourable and Learned Member for Beaconsfield to preserve Lord's Amendment 19p, which ensures Parliament a meaningful vote in the Brexit process. Mr. Speaker, we need to be clear what this amendment is and what it is not. It is not about frustrating or blocking Brexit. It is not about tying the hands of the UK negotiators, and it would not empower Parliament to direct the government in the ongoing negotiations. It is simply about this House playing a meaningful role in the terms of the final Brexit deal. It's about making sure that on the most important peacetime issue this House has faced for a generation, this House is not silenced. This amendment addresses two simple questions. What happens if Parliament rejects the Prime Minister's proposed Article 50 deal in the autumn? And what happens if by the 21st of January next year there is no Article 50 deal or no prospect of an Article 50 deal? The Prime Minister has said consistently, tough luck. If you don't like my proposed deal, you can have something much worse. That is not meaningful. The Brexit Secretary, once a great guardian of the role of this House, now wants to sideline Parliament when its voice is most needed. He says that in the event that the Prime Minister's proposed Article 50 deal is rejected by Parliament, or there's no Article 50 deal, a minister will make a statement. Well, I should think so. After 2 years of negotiation, the government brings back a deal which is rejected, and a minister will make a statement. And he says, not in 28 days, but 21. 21 days. That's democracy. That's giving Parliament a real voice.
Greatest Parliament.
And then, a further safeguard. There will be a neutral motion. Well, there's an example of a neutral motion, Mr. Speaker, on the order paper today. There's to be a debate about NATO. And what will be decided is this, that this House has considered NATO. That's the additional safeguard, that this House has considered the Article 50 deal. And that's it. That's the role of this House on the most important decision that we'll make in this Parliament. No one who values parliamentary sovereignty should accept either approach, and that's why this amendment is crucial. It requires the government to back up any statement made by a minister with a motion that can be voted on. It permits Parliament to have a meaningful say, but only after negotiations are complete. Mr. Speaker, of course, the very idea of Parliament actually having a say prompts the usual cries, and I've no doubt many of the interventions will be along these lines, so let me deal with them. The usual cries are these. It's an attempt to frustrate Brexit. It will weaken the Prime Minister's negotiating hand. Parliament cannot micromanage the negotiation. So let me meet those objections. First, we've heard it all before. Yes. In August 2016, we challenged the government to produce a plan. Oh, yes. What did they say? That will frustrate Brexit. Yeah. It will tie our hands. It'll play into the hands of the EU. Yeah. And then they had to accept a motion to produce a plan, and the sky didn't fall in. Yeah. In the autumn of 2016, we challenged the government to give members of this House a vote on the proposed Article 50 deal. The same response from the same people across this House. It'll frustrate the process. It'll tie the Prime Minister's hands. It'll play into the hands of the EU. And then what? Lancaster House speech, January 2017. Prime Minister agrees to give MPs a vote, and the sky did not fall in. December 2017, we challenged the government to put the Article 50 vote into legislation. It was contested. Amendment 7. The usual reasons, the usual response. It'll frustrate Brexit. It'll play into the hands of the EU. It'll tie the Prime Minister's hands. Amendment 7 was voted against the government VIP. And the sky did not fall in. And in February of this year, Mr. Speaker, we challenged the government to publish the impact assessments. The usual response. It'll frustrate Brexit. It'll tie the Prime Minister's hands. It'll play into the hands of the EU. And then the impact assessments were published and the sky did not fall in. So this amendment is not about frustrating the process, it's about making sure there is a process. Second, Mr. Speaker, we have to confront this. The biggest threat to an orderly Brexit and the biggest threat of no deal is and always has been division at the heart of government. They cannot agree the fundamentals. The customs arrangements is hardly an unexpected issue that was going to arise. No one should be under any illusion that the EU somehow cannot see the fundamental weakness in the government's position. I do give way, and I'll give way over.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for giving way. Will the Shadow Secretary of State confirm that the Labour Party is not trying to frustrate Brexit, and in fact, the Labour Party policy and the policy of our front bench is that we will be leaving the European Union in March 2019.
I'm grateful for that intervention. I know how important that is for the honourable member in her constituency, and I can confirm that position, which has always been our position. Mr. Speaker, I will give way.
I thank my right honourable friend for giving way, and I thank him for at least allowing somebody from this side to have an intervention which the Secretary of State didn't have the decency to do. Could my right honourable friend explain what on earth a meaningful vote can mean if it's a Hobson's choice Brexit, the deal we've done, or no deal at all? And isn't that Hobson's choice Brexit and avoiding it what this entire debate is now about?
Absolutely. I'm grateful for that intervention because that goes to the heart of the issue. Parliament to be given a vote on Article 50, and if you don't like what the Prime Minister's brought back, you can have something much worse. A child would see through that as not an acceptable choice. I will give way.
Doesn't it come down to this, though, and perhaps the benches opposite are missing the central point? In any negotiation, if you rule out a no deal, it guarantees a worst outcome. Anyone who has conducted a negotiation in business understands that. If the opposition benches don't understand that, then they're missing the central point.
I'm grateful for that intervention. I've always been curious about this tactic. What happens at the end of the negotiation is that if there's no deal, is that you are pushed over a cliff. Yes. Volunteering to jump first has never appeared to me to be a great tactic. But no, because I want to complete this point. No, not yet, because I want to complete the answer. No deal was never a credible threat. And as each day goes past, it's less credible. There is no immigration law that can come into force in March 2019. There are no staff to administer it. There's no customs arrangements. There's no infrastructure. If we don't have a deal, we don't have any arrangements for law and security. It is not a credible threat, and therefore this whole notion that we have to pretend we're going to do something which is incredible has no bargaining impact. I'm going to make some progress, if I may. No. Mr. Speaker, the third point that's taken against our position is based on the proposition, and this is the argument that this somehow passes an advantage to the EU. It's based on the proposition that but for this amendment, the Prime Minister would, undisturbed in her course, take us out of the EU without a deal. that she would calmly and with the full support of this House head for the cliff of no deal. That seems to be extremely unlikely. This amendment is about what happens at the end of the negotiations, not the beginning. It allows Parliament to have a meaningful role once the negotiations are over, and it does not tie the government's hands during the negotiations. But it does mean that the course the government takes in the event that the Article 50 is voted down or there's no deal has to be supported by a majority in this House. Standing back, Mr. Speaker, that is common sense. It is unthinkable that any Prime Minister would seek to force through a course of action with significant consequences for many, many years, which the majority in this House did not approve of. That is unthinkable. That is unthinkable. And the idea that that is how you would achieve an orderly Brexit is for the birds. What this amendment does is to provide order where otherwise there would be utter chaos. And for those reasons, I urge honourable and right honourable members on all sides to support the amendment tabled by the right honourable and learned member for Beaconsfield to preserve Lord's Amendment 19p. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you. Order to move Manuscript Amendment B. I call Mr. Dominic Grieve.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to you for having enabled this amendment to be considered this afternoon by accepting my manuscript. It's a very odd aspect, and I have to say very unsatisfactory aspect of the way our Parliament does its business, that we can end up on ping-pong frequently debating amendments that are in fact irrelevant to what the House is really troubled about. In order to get to this point, I have to tell the House it's been necessary to also twist the rules of procedure in the other place, and I am immensely grateful to those peers who facilitated the manuscript amendment that took place there and enabled us this afternoon for the first time to consider the issue of the meaningful vote in relation both to the government's view of what it should be and the suggestion that had come from their Lordships' House. And I'd like to say here and now how deeply I object to the way in which they get vilified for doing the job that we have asked them to do, which is to act as a revising chamber and to send back to this House proposals for our consideration. Mr. Speaker, the issue has been highlighted by the earlier speakers is about the form that a meaningful vote should take. There are two options in front of the House. The House will recall that when this matter first arose last week, the amendment that had come from the Lords included a mandatory element, something which I have to say is rather constitutionally unusual. I don't think it's happened since the Civil War in the 17th century. And I'm not sure it ended very well. I seem to recall it ended with this bauble from Oliver Cromwell in relation to the mace. And because of that, I certainly considered that it was excessive. And I apologise to the House that in trying to produce something else, I probably didn't, very late at night last week, draft as well as I might have done. But it led to a sensible discussion prompted by my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, who had a number of us in her room and said she would do her best to meet the concerns we were expressing on there not being a meaningful vote on no deal. Last Thursday, I have to tell the House, it looked as if we were going to reach an agreement based on exactly the terms of the Lord's amendment that has come back to us. But at a very late stage, it was indicated to me that the government didn't feel able to proceed with that. I'd like to emphasise that I make absolutely no criticism of those with whom I negotiated and who behaved impeccably in this matter. Indeed, at the end of the day, I have to accept that sometimes negotiations may founder at the last minute. But it was unfortunate. It was unfortunate from my point of view, and I'll come back to that point briefly in a moment. But be that as it may, the government's tabled amendment was the one that we are being asked to accept today. The one which simply asks us to note and doesn't give us the opportunity of amending. Two arguments have been put to me to justify this change when it occurred and in the negotiations that followed. The first one was that there was concern about the justiciability of the amendment. It's right to say that the standing orders of the House cannot, in my view, be impugned in any court outside this High Court of Parliament. But it's right to say that if one puts reference to the standing orders into a statute, it can raise some very interesting, if somewhat arcane, legal issues about the extent to which a challenge could be brought. My own view on this is I don't believe that the amendment, which is currently the Lord's amendments come to us, is credibly open to challenge. And for that matter, I happen to think that the government amendment is not credibly open to challenge either, although it's worth pointing out to the House that it is as credibly, or is as likely to be challenged or capable of being challenged as the other. So I don't accept a differentiation between them. Yeah. That was the first argument. The second argument that was put forward was of a very different kind. It was said to me, and I think it was picked up by the opposition frontbench spokesman, that the government had real concerns that this issue, which I have to say I think is an issue of detail, had acquired such a status with those with whom we were negotiating that it could undermine the government's negotiating position in trying to get the United Kingdom the best possible deal for leaving the EU. Now, I have to say, speaking personally, I found that a difficult thing to accept from my own range of contacts and how I've thought the EU is likely to work. But I have to say to the House, I don't think it's an issue which I, as a supporter of the government, can entirely ignore. I am very troubled about Brexit. It's well known in this House that I believe that we have made a historic mistake in voting to leave. I am very open-minded as to what the best course of action should be, whilst respectful of the decision of the electorate in the referendum result. I dislike very much the extent to which we can be fettered or pushed into frameworks of what we have or have not to accept in that negotiation. But that is, if I may say so, a reason why I should also give as much latitude to the concerns of my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, as she indicates to me she might have. My right honourable friend.
No,
I wish to conclude.
So in those circumstances, I think that there is an issue which I can't ignore. Now, as the House will have noticed this afternoon, a statement was tabled, or was sent, which will be a written ministerial statement tomorrow, by the Secretary of State. The first part of it deals with the position of the Speaker. And of course, if I may put it slightly, the piquancy of this is that having on the one hand said that an unamendable motion to note is an unamendable motion to note in a statute, the fact is it really has absolutely no force at all, because the reality is it's part of the standing orders of this House, it's not open to any interpretation in any court, and it will ultimately be entirely your responsibility, Mr. Speaker, to decide what can or shouldn't be treated as a neutral terms motion. So actually it highlights the fact that although this debate has been about trying to provide assurance, not just in this House, but to many, many members of the public outside who are worried about the end of this process and what might happen. Though it's been designed to provide assurance, the truth is the assurance doesn't lie in the words of the statute, except insofar as the statute is the word of the government. The assurance lies in the hands of this House, and in the first part of this statement, in the power of the Speaker. I then insisted that a second piece be put into it, which I will read out. It says, if I may say so, it's something which ought to be blindingly obvious. The government recognises that it is open for ministers and members of the House of Commons to table motions on and debate matters of concern, and that, as is the convention, parliamentary time will be provided for this. And the truth is that if this House chooses to debate matters, including matters on which it may wish to have multiple motions,
The reality is that if we wish to exert our power to do it, we can. And in the circumstances that might follow a no deal, which would undoubtedly be one of the biggest political crises in modern British history, if the House wishes to speak with one voice, or indeed multiple voices, and compare those, the House has the power to do it. And the suggestion coming from... I shall give way to the honourable gentleman.
I'm grateful. That the bit I don't understand is, in the last few years, there have been lots of things carried by this House, motions tabled by the Backbench Business Committee, by the opposition, by ordinary members of the House. The government has just let them go through and then completely ignore them. Yes. The only thing that has legislative effect is legislation. That's why we have to have a meaningful vote, not a pretend one.
Yes, the right honourable gentleman is right, but we take just to pause and consider where we are. If we accepted if the government were to concede the motion as drafted, the amendment as drafted in the laws for an amendable motion, it must be understood by the House that the government could ignore it. And I can assure the House it would not be enforceable in any court of law. No, it's really got to be understood. It would not. It could not be enforceable in any court of law because that would entirely undermine the rights and privileges of this place. It would be for us to enforce it. And of course, the ultimate sanction that this House has is a motion of no confidence. But short of that, there are other means by which the House can, in fact, bring its very clear view to bear on the government. Now, in view of that acknowledgement... No, I won't. Sorry. In view of that acknowledgement, I have to say I weigh that and the clear words of this statement against what my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, has told me about her anxieties. And my judgment, and it's a purely personal one, is that my view is that if that is the issue, then having finally obtained, I have to say with a little bit more difficulty than I would have wished, the obvious acknowledgement of the sovereignty of this place and its over the executive in black and white language, I am prepared to accept the government's difficulty and support it. I'm prepared to accept the government's difficulty and, in the circumstances, to accept the form of amendment it wants. I'd like to emphasise one other point. I shall formally move at the end of this. I don't wish to deprive the House of the right to vote on this if it wishes. It's absolute right to disagree, but speaking personally, it seems to me that with that acknowledgement having been properly made, I am content to go down that course. And finally, Mr. Speaker, because I want to sit down. Finally, I just want to say this. The difficult... No, I wish to end. Finally, I want to say this. We do face some real difficulties at the moment. It's rightly said that those who the gods want to destroy, they first render mad. And I have to say there's enough madness around at the moment to make one start to question whether collective sanity in this country has disappeared. Every time sensible, reasoned argument tries to be presented in this House, vilification and abuse follows, death threats for right honourable and honourable friends. There is a hysteria which completely loses sight of the issues that we have to really consider. And I have to say there's an atmosphere of bullying which has the directly opposite consequence, that it puts people into a position where they feel that they are unable to compromise, because by doing so they will be immediately described as having lost, as if these were arguments to be lost or won. The issue must be that we get it right. And of course, the other end of the spectrum, Mr. Speaker, we get some really ridiculous things. I've had the Daily Mail crawling over the garden of my house in France. And I don't know quite what they were looking for. I think they were looking for silos in which missiles might be aimed at the mansion of my right honourable friend, and my friend, the member for North East Somerset. There is a history of monsters and witches in the area where I have a holiday home, chucking megaliths backwards and forwards across the channel. Such is the state, Mr. Speaker, of our discourse. But I will just say this. That is the very thing that we must avoid. We are going to have differences, and I finally say to the government this. Those differences may extend to my, as a Member of Parliament, taking a different view if there's no deal from what the government might wish. This House has a right to act if that happens in order to protect the interests of the British people, and the responsibility in those circumstances lies as much with us as it does with the government.
Order. The question is that Amendment B be made. I just very gently point out we have fewer than 45 minutes, and I do want to accommodate other backbench members. Mr. Peter Grant.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful for the chance to take part in this debate. Well, once again, Mr. Speaker, we'll be hearing the siren voices of the hardline no-deal Brexiteers, of whom there are some in this place, claiming that they and they alone have a monopoly on respect for democracy, a monopoly on respect for Parliament, and a monopoly on a patriotic love for their chosen country. They're going to demonstrate their regard for democracy by unilaterally and retrospectively changing the question that was asked in the referendum in 2016, but assuming that the answer will stay the same. They're going to demonstrate their respect for Parliament by doing their damnedest to keep Parliament out of playing any meaningful role in the most important events any of us are ever likely to live through. And they demonstrate their patriotic love for their country by pushing an agenda that threatens to fundamentally damage the social and economic foundations on which their country, and indeed all of our respective countries, were built. Because, Mr. Speaker, there should be no doubt whatsoever about what the hardliners are seeking to achieve here. They tell us that these amendments are about attempting to stop Brexit. But in their private briefings to each other, they tell themselves that they're worried that these amendments might stop a cliff edge, no-deal Brexit. And, Mr. Speaker, that is precisely what I want these amendments to stop. They're seeking to create a situation where if, as seems increasingly likely by the day, a severely weakened Prime Minister, possibly in the last days of her Prime Ministership, comes back from Brussels with a miserable deal that nobody can welcome, they want to make sure the only option is to crash out of the European Union with no agreement on anything. And while I hear the Secretary of State's words and warning that you don't go into a negotiation if you can't afford to walk away, can I remind the Secretary of State that on the day the government sent that Article 50 letter, they started to walk away. From that date, they had no deal. The negotiation now is to try to salvage something from the wreckage of that disastrous mistake. The far-right European Research Group would have us believe that their opposition to the amendment is simply about stopping Parliament from being allowed to tell the government what to do. Mr. Speaker, I'm no expert in English history, but I thought the Civil War was about whether Parliament had the right to tell the monarch and the government what to do. But the real reason, I'll give way here.
Does the honourable gentleman not see that this Parliament finds itself in a very strange position? This Parliament is actually not wanting to have a vote. In fact, I think they had a vote not to hold a vote, but if they were not wanting to have a vote, it's legitimate to have a vote, not to hold a vote. Absolutely bizarre dereliction of responsibility by this Parliament, and this is why we need Scottish independence and not the mess and the carnage we're seeing in front of us here.
My honourable friend from Nayland and Yar makes a very valid point, that the reason that some in this House are determined not to give Parliament a meaningful vote is because they're worried that an overwhelming majority of parliamentarians on all sides of the House might vote against the cliff edge scenario that they have already plotted out for us. The real reason that some on the opposite benches, and even one or two on the opposition benches, have to act now to block off the chance of this so-called sovereign parliament having any powers whatsoever over this, is that they know that if they put their true agenda before the House, it will be defeated, and in all probability it will be defeated by a majority that is numbered in the hundreds rather than the tens or the dozens. The government has to be protected at all costs from Parliament, because Parliament might do something the government wasn't like. Isn't that what parliaments are for? Especially a parliament in which the government has lost its democratic mandate to form a majority government by its own cynical calling of an unnecessary and disruptive election. The Prime Minister has said, please don't accept these amendments because she doesn't want to have her hands tied. Well, Mr Speaker, it's none of my business whether the Prime Minister likes having her hands tied, her feet tied or anything else tied. But surely the whole point in a parliament is so that there is somebody with democratic credibility and democratic accountability to keep the government in check when it is clear to everyone that the government is going in the wrong direction. I'll give you in a minute. And if plunging over a cliff edge is not the wrong direction, I don't know what is.
Hear, hear. And whilst he has indicated that it's not of his business whether the Prime Minister has her hands tied, feet tied or what else, would he accept that it is in the interest of the country for the Prime Minister to have the freedom to go and negotiate the best deal for the country, and Parliament can't negotiate the detail of that deal, only the Prime Minister can do that?
Which country?
Well, Mr Speaker, nothing in the amendment that we're speaking to, or the amendments we're speaking to today, contains any desire for Parliament to be involved in the negotiations. But what we're being asked to believe is that there is no possibility at all that the negotiations will fail. That's what we're being asked to believe, except that those who give us that promise, some of them are hoping that the negotiations will fail, because some of them have already decided that they want to push for a no-deal Brexit, despite the calamitous consequences that were outlined earlier by the right honourable member on the opposition front bench. I'll give way.
I'd like to thank my honourable friend for his speech. Does he agree with me that this appears to have more to do with trying to hold the Tory party together, negotiating amongst themselves as we speak, rather than the benefit of the whole United Kingdom?
I think my honourable friend and constituency neighbour makes a very, very valid point. In fact, it's worth to remember the only reason we had a referendum in the first place was because it was going to bring the Tory party together. Well, that worked out well, didn't it? Mr Speaker, the reason that some on opposite benches get so hot under the collar about the danger of giving Parliament a meaningful vote is because if the House, they say, if the House approves rather than simply considering something, they claim it could subsequently be used as a basis for a legal challenge. Now, I'm not going to gainsay the words of the right honourable and very learned member for Beaconsfield, but what's interesting is that the two cases that they quote in their own document to prove that it could lead to a legal challenge, both of them resulted in rulings that actions of the House, whether it was a resolution, a committee decision or an order of Parliament, did not have the status of an Act of Parliament. Interestingly, one of the cases was about a pornography publisher who sued Hansard for damaging his reputation as a publisher. Mr Speaker, this briefing also contains a dark, dark warning about what could happen if the government loses the vote at the end of the process. It could undermine the government's authority, it could undermine the government's position. In fact, in their exact words, this could produce an unstable zombie government. Sadly, Mr Speaker, the briefing doesn't go on to give any indication as to how any of us would be able to tell the difference. But the real giveaway is in the third of the three practical problems they see in the Lord's amendment. Again, quoting directly, Mr Speaker, it effectively seeks to take no deal off the table. And that, Mr Speaker, is the real agenda here. I want no deal off the table. The Secretary of State doesn't want no deal, so why is it still on the table? But the intention, Mr Speaker, is that not under any circumstances will Parliament have the right to pull us back from the cliff edge. It's not just about keeping no deal on the table. It's about making sure that by the time we come to make the decision, there is nothing else on the table other than no deal. Mr. Speaker, in my younger days, which I can just about vaguely remember, I used to be a very keen armchair mountaineer. I loved reading books about mountaineering and hill walking. And one of the books I read was an account of the first ever ascent of the Matterhorn in 1865. Now, the Matterhorn, unlike some cliff edges, didn't have safety barriers. Edward Whymper and his 6 companions got to the summit, but during the descent, 4 of the party fell over a cliff to their deaths after the rope holding the group together had broken. There were, of course, suggestions of foul play and murder most foul, but what had happened was that the rope just wasn't strong enough. In fact, if the rope hadn't broken, it's quite likely that all 7 would have been killed. Mr. Speaker, there are hardline Brexiteers in this House who are determined to drag us over that cliff edge. I want Parliament to be allowed to erect a safety barrier, not to stop those who want to get to the bottom of the cliff from reaching their destination, but to make sure that anybody who gets there in one piece. Yes. And while, as I've made perfectly clear before, I have no intention of usurping the democratic right of the people of England to take good or bad decisions for themselves. No one has the right to usurp the democratic decisions of the people of Scotland. Yeah. And let me just remind the government once again that if they seek to drag their people over the cliff edge, our people are not going to follow. Yeah. And they might well find, in fact they will find, that there is not a rope in existence that is strong enough to hold Scotland to their country if their country seeks to take us over that cliff edge.
Yeah. With immediate effect, a 4-minute limit on backbench speeches will apply. Mr. Philip Davis.
Mr. Speaker, can I first of all say that I very much agree with my right honourable and learned friend from Beaconsfield about the nature of political debate in this country. He's absolutely right to point that out, and I agree with him wholeheartedly. The second point I want to make, Mr. Speaker, is that many people in this House seem to forget that there's been 2 meaningful votes. The first meaningful vote was this House deciding to give a referendum to the British people. And the second meaningful vote was the referendum result itself, in which the people voted to leave the European Union. They were meaningful votes. Now, the point, I'm not giving away because time's limited. The point is, Mr. Speaker, is that what's happened since then is that some people who didn't like the result of that referendum, and perhaps didn't even expect the result of that referendum, have now found a newfound enthusiasm for the rights of this Parliament to decide all sorts of things, because they were quite happy for all of these powers to be given over to the European Union willy-nilly. Now they've got this newfound enthusiasm that this House should decide everything. That if only, I'm not going to give away, if that only were the case before. Now, I do excuse from this, Mr. Speaker, my right honourable and learned friend, the member for Rushcliffe. He didn't vote to have a referendum, and therefore there is absolutely no reason why he should feel in any way bound by the result of that referendum. And I perfectly respect that. His position has been entirely consistent. What I have no time for, Mr. Speaker, are people... I'm not going to give way, even though he is the father of the House. I'll give way to the father.
Just briefly, to make it clear that this totally irrelevant argument that we're trying to reverse the referendum is as irrelevant to me as it is to any other of my honourable and right honourable friends. This House voted for an enormous majority to invoke Article 50. We're now trying to debate and have parliamentary influence over what we're going to do when we've left, and what the form of our new arrangements with Europe and the rest of the world will be. So could he please stop yet again arguing, not just him, I mean, he's the ultimate member to do it, introducing this totally irrelevant argument and trying to say what is wrong with the process actually set out in the Lord's Amendment. What is the excessive power that it apparently gives to this House to have a say when the negotiations are finished?
Well, I'm afraid, Mr. Speaker, that the public are not fooled by the motives of people who are clearly wanting to delay, frustrate or overturn the result of the referendum. It's a shame some of them can't admit it. The right honourable member, the Shadow Secretary of State, said that people had said over a long period of time that if we did this, Brexit would be frustrated. If we did that, Brexit would be frustrated. Can I suggest to the Shadow Secretary of State, he gets out of London, he gets out a bit, because what people around the country feel is that Brexit is being frustrated. It's already been frustrated by a great deal by this House. And so the idea that he thinks Brexit hasn't been frustrated, he needs to get... Well, my right honourable friend who has taken a vow of independence since he lost his job as a government minister that was never shown before, asked how. I would invite him to get out. He's very welcome up to Yorkshire to actually see what... well, he speak to people, Mr Speaker. He should speak to people. The fact is, Mr Speaker, is that I'm perfectly content for this House to have a vote. Absolutely, it should have a vote on whether it wants to accept the deal negotiated by the government that it comes back with. Absolutely right that this House votes on whether or not to accept that deal. And the government should accept the vote of this House. What it cannot do, having decided to give the people a vote in a referendum, it cannot find some strange parliamentary mechanism in order to frustrate and overturn the result. He didn't give way, and I'm not going to give way either because time is limited. We cannot vote to reverse the decision of the referendum. And people outside this House, Mr Speaker, need to know this very clearly today, that those people... I'm not going to give way, there isn't time. I want people to know outside of this House that those people today who are voting for this meaningful vote, what they mean is that if the government decides that no deal is better than a bad deal, and it doesn't go to show how out of touch this place is that it's even a contentious statement that no deal is better than a bad deal. I mean, it's a statement of the blindingly obvious, but it's amazing that some people find that a contentious statement. Mr Speaker, I am not giving way to let other people have time. People should bear that. I'm giving way to the Father of the House. Mr Speaker, I appreciate that the Honourable Eva Broxo doesn't like hearing arguments with which she disagrees, but I'm going to plough on regardless, despite her chuntering from a sedentary position. The point is, Mr Speaker, that the fact is that no deal is better than a bad deal is blindingly obvious to anybody with even a modicum of common sense. What people in this House are being invited to do is that if the government decide that no deal is better than a bad deal, that this House should somehow be able to say to the government, you've got to continue being a member of the European Union while you go back and renegotiate this and renegotiate that. I cannot stand aside and allow that to happen, Mr Speaker, and I don't think the British people will thank anybody in this House who votes that way. And let nobody be in any doubt, anybody who votes for this meaningful vote today, their constituents should know they are voting to try and keep us in the European Union against their will.
Mr Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. May I say to the honourable gentleman that the argument he's just advanced is not true. It is not true. And the fact is, I think there are a very small number of members of the House who would cheerfully jump over the edge of a no-deal cliff. And that is why we're having this argument this afternoon. Now, I say to the Right Honourable and learned member for Beaconsfield, for whom I have enormous respect, he is right when he says that this is a very fraught, difficult, tense debate. Passions are running high. Given that the referendum split the country right down the middle, that is not entirely surprising. But I would just gently say to him that given the experience he went through last week, where he thought he had an assurance and then discovered that he did not, if I were him, I would be very, very cautious about accepting further assurances, but I respect the decision that he makes. And the reason I would be cautious is for the reason that I put the question to the Secretary of State, who is no longer in his place. I listened very carefully to what the Secretary of State said, and I heard no explanation, no justification, and no argument for why the government is prepared for the House to debate an amendable motion to approve the withdrawal agreement, because that is what the Secretary of State indicated when he came before the Select Committee. It's happy to do that, but when it comes to deciding what takes place in the event that the nation is facing the prospect of no deal, the government is insisting on having a motion in neutral terms, which may or may not allow the Speaker to come to the rescue of the House to allow the motion to be declared amendable. But as I read Standing Order 24B, as long as the government does its job in drafting the motion, the Speaker will have no choice but to declare it a motion in neutral terms, and therefore is not amendable. I will give way to my right honourable friend.
Does this not give enormous power to you, Mr. Speaker, which is all very well because you are a Speaker who has stood up for the rights of this House, for the rights of backbenchers, and for the majority of this House to be able to have meaningful votes. But were Mr. Speaker to fall under a bus in the next few months, what guarantee would there be that a future Speaker would stand up for this House's rights in the same way that you have?
Observe the road safety code. Mr. Hilary Benn.
It's not for me to advise you, Mr. Speaker, but please don't cross any roads between now and the end of this process.
Get an online delivery.
It seems to me that the government's intention throughout has been to seek to neuter this House when we come to the end of the process. Because we're talking about the possibility of facing no deal at all. I thought my right honourable and learned friend who spoke from our front bench put it out very, very clearly, because not only would we be facing economic difficulty of the most serious kind, impacts on trade, on our services industry, on our broadcasting, on the security of the nation, because if with no deal in place, how would the exchange of information continue? These are not minor matters, these go to the heart of the government's responsibility to make sure that we are safe and that industry works and taxes are raised and public services are paid for. That is why people are getting exercised about this. This is not some amendment on one bill. It is the most important decision the country has faced for generations. And secondly, as my right honourable and learned friend pointed out, we're not ready. We're not ready to cope with that consequence. And therefore, I just say to members, contemplate this for a moment. If, because the House can't do anything about it, we fall off the edge of the cliff, and future generations look at us and say, what did you do at that moment?
Absolutely.
What did you do? Didn't you say anything? Are we really, as a House of Commons, going to allow our hands to be bound and say, well, at least I took note of what was happening?
Will he give way on that point?
Mr. Speaker, our responsibility is not to take note. It is to take charge, to take responsibility, to do our job. And I will give way to the right honourable and learned gentleman.
I can assure him that if he looks at the standing orders of this House, if this House wants to take charge at that point, it will be able to do so. And I will join with him, if necessary, in doing just that.
Well, I absolutely bow to the right honourable and learned gentleman's expertise, but as my right honourable friend pointed out earlier in the debate, I'm afraid, sitting on these benches with this government, we have seen too many occasions, time and time again, where the House has used the standing orders to debate a matter and pass a motion, and the government sits there and says, we're not taking any notice of you whatsoever. And that is why ensuring that we have the right to amend a motion is now, in the next few minutes, in the hands of this House. There will be no further opportunity to take back control, and I hope the House will do so by voting in favour.
I urge members to help each other. Antoinette Sandbach.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful again to the other place for sending us this amendment. This is an issue that I have been concerned about since the referendum, and I have been quite open in my views around the need for a meaningful vote and parliamentary sovereignty. This, in my view, is about our country's future and ensuring that we enhance and not reduce our democracy. When re-elected last year, my constituents were under no illusions about how important I thought a meaningful vote was, as I had already made my concerns public and indeed voted for one during the Article 50 process. Views may differ regarding the desirability of no deal, In my view, it would be utterly catastrophic for my constituents and the industries in which they work. But surely all sides welcome the certainty this amendment brings to the process. We are often accused of wanting to tie the government's hands. Nothing could be further from the truth. How can this amendment tie the hands of the government during negotiations when it concerns steps that should be taken when negotiations have broken down? In other words, it concentrates on events after the end of the negotiations. I support the government's negotiation, and I strongly believe that the Prime Minister will succeed in her negotiation. However, not to have a process in place for what would happen should negotiations collapse would be irresponsible. And what is more, this amendment will ensure that when the Prime Minister sits down to negotiate, our European partners know that she does so with the full backing of Parliament. Far from binding the Prime Minister, it strengthens her hands. And I would encourage all my colleagues to recognise that this amendment empowers both Parliament and our negotiators. It lays out a contingency should disaster strike, and it delivers on a commitment to take back control to Parliament.
Order. A 3-minute limit will now apply. Mr Tom Brake.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, for selecting Amendment A. My pleasure at being able to speak on this is enhanced by the fact that this opportunity came completely out of the blue, but I welcome that. Now, the principal purpose of this amendment is to provide clarity that in all eventualities there will be the opportunity for people to have a final say on any deal that the government strikes, and also that Parliament will not be left stranded with no deal. With that would come closure of our ports, food shortages, medicine shortages and general chaos. And if people on the other side don't believe it, I would advise them to go to talk to the Port Authority at Dover to hear from them what they think no deal would mean. So, Mr Speaker, I make no apology for the fact that I do want to stop Brexit, and I don't think that probably comes as a surprise to many people in this chamber. But I don't actually believe that the amendment that was put forward today by the Right Honourable Member and Learned Member for Beaconsfield, or indeed my own amendment, would actually achieve it. Brexit is a calamity. We are going to be poorer, more insecure, less influential. We will have fewer friends in the world and more enemies as a result, and that is happening already. Now, some members opposite know it and say it. Some members opposite know it and keep quiet. Some members opposite know it and claim the opposite, and I'm not going to embarrass those who shared platforms with me during the EU referendum campaign who were saying that it would cause calamity but are now claiming the opposite. Some members opposite know it, or in fact some members opposite deny it. Their life's ambition has been to achieve Brexit, and they could not possibly accept that it is now doing us harm. I'm happy to give way.
Honourable Members, a fine speech. To put some numbers on this calamity, it's a no-deal Brexit is an 8% damage event to GDP. For context, the 2008 crash was a 2% damage event to GDP. What the over-the-cliff Brexiteers is looking for is to damage the UK economy 4 times the level of the 2008 crash. Well done, guys.
Absolutely. So we understand the calamity that would be no deal, and that's why I think nobody here nor in the European Union believes that the government would actually settle for that because of the consequences that it would have on our economy. I'll just make a bit more progress in the minute and a half that's left. Now, there would be a chorus of the will of the people from the other benches if time allowed. But the will of the people, 2 points I'd make about that. 2 years on from the 23rd of June 2016, who is clear in terms of what the will of the people now is? And of course, the whole purpose of providing a final say on the deal is to test whether the will of the people is the same now as it was 2 years ago. And the final point I would make is whether we are, as members of Parliament, delegates or representatives. We are elected to use our judgment from the PM downwards, who campaigned to remain because she used her judgment and thought that Brexit would cause us damage. She was right. And would cause damage to communities up and down the country. Many members opposite used their judgment then. I'm afraid that their judgment now seems to have left them. And the government's own assessment confirmed that the impact of Brexit is going to be wholly negative. So the delegates in this House will push on with a policy that is detrimental to British families. The representatives in this House will recognise that a way out of this ideological nightmare that we've got ourselves into has to be found. And so today we will be able to decide, we'll be able to demonstrate which of those two things we are, delegates or representatives.
Thank you. Mr. Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think my honourable and right honourable and learned friend, the member for Beaconsfield, got it absolutely right in his response to the chairman of the Brexit Select Committee, that the constitutional power of this House to determine who is in government is entirely unaffected by these amendments or the written ministerial statement that will be laid tomorrow. The powers, the authority of the rights of this House remain intact, and that is not dependent on whether a meaningful vote is amendable or unamendable. Mr. Speaker, as an historian of this House and its powers, you know perfectly well that the Norway debate was held on the adjournment of the House, whether it should adjourn or not for the Whitsun recess. That led, that great issue of the time, whether Whitsun should have a few days off, led to a fundamental change in the government and the whole history of our nation that flowed from it. Unamendable motions. I do apologise, the Honourable Lady, I won't give way because other people want to speak and time is very short. So the rights of this House are intact. I think the legislation will ensure that the government can pursue its objectives, and that is very important, and the Chief Whip is in his place, and I would like to commend him for the tactful way he has discussed these issues with so many people over the last week to ensure that we could come to something that everybody on this side of the House is able to agree to and put their names to, that maintains the privileges of this House, ensures the government can negotiate properly, and sends the Prime Minister to the negotiating table, and my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, with a united House of Commons behind him.
Here. Seema Malhotra.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak today, and I will make just a couple of remarks. Mr. Speaker, I want to reiterate the argument, the comments that have been made, that this is not about reversing Brexit and not about tying the hands of the government. This is about what happens and the role of Parliament if things go wrong. Mr. Speaker, it is about clarity, about what will happen in this Parliament and in the interests of our country in the event of no deal or no deal being agreed by this House. It is incredibly disappointing to have reached this position. It could have been so different. Mr. Speaker, a week after the referendum, I wrote to the then Prime Minister. I then wrote to the current Prime Minister, and I made the argument that it was in the interests of our country that this House came together, that we had ways of working across party and across this House, the House of Commons and the House of Lords, the other place, and that we came to a solution together and we worked through the issues together. But step by step, Mr. Speaker, we have seen a government that has run and a government that is hidden, a government that has not wanted to even bring forward its own impact assessments so that we can take place in an evidence-based debate about the impact of Brexit on our country and get the answer right. Mr. Speaker, a process by which this country comes together is essential. If what happens in the autumn is that we reach a situation where what was unthinkable becomes thinkable, and to have a way in which we handle that is our responsibility. Mr. Speaker, every large government project has a risk register and has a response to those risks. This is a critical risk for our country, and it is vital that in advance of such a situation we all know what's going to happen and that we have a say on behalf of our constituents for what could be an incredibly catastrophic situation for our economy, our country and our society.
I would like to accommodate further speakers. Mr. Kenneth Clark.
Mr. Speaker, I shall make the shortest speech here I've made for very many years and take no into account. Well, the government is restricting debate on its European issue as ferociously as it's trying to restrict votes and powers. I voted against both the previous timetable motions. With no explanation, we've been told we've got an hour and a half for this extremely important issue today, presumably in order to allow time for an interesting debate that follows, taking note on the subject of NATO, which could be tabled any time in the next fortnight and has no urgency whatever. So none of us allowed to say very much about it. The government throughout has been trying to minimise the parliamentary role in the process. That is only too obvious. I'll try to avoid reading anything that others have said, but the fact is it started with an attempt to deny the House any vote on the invocation of Article 50, and it required litigation to change that. And the issue of a meaningful vote has been resisted since it was first proposed, and the government has suffered a defeat in this House at the earlier stages of our proceedings before they would contemplate it, and then they assured us they wouldn't try to reverse that. There would be a meaningful vote. But actually, because that amendment needs amplification, the bill needs to be made clearer, we now have this vital last stage of the Lord's amendments and the final attempt to spell out what meaningful votes and parliamentary influence is supposed to mean, and it's being resisted to the very last moment. Last week, I thought the government was going to be defeated because of its resistance. I was not invited to the negotiations because I don't blame the Chief Whip for that in the slightest. I've not fallen out with him personally, but I think he knew I would take a rather firm line because I saw nothing wrong with Lord Hailsham's amendment if nothing else was available. My right honourable and honourable friends, including my right honourable friend for Beaconsfield, actually believed they had undertakings to the Prime Minister, and I believe the Prime Minister gave those undertakings in good faith. He negotiated with a very distinguished member of the government acting on the Prime Minister's behalf, and they reached a firm agreement. That agreement is substantially reflected in the Lord's amendment we have before us now, and they expected that it would be tabled. It was not. And now the government is resisting the very issue upon which a very distinguished member of the government reached a settlement, to use the legal terms, last week, because the government's not be able to live up to its agreement. And we're being asked to substitute for a perfectly reasonable Lord's amendment, a convoluted thing which will be argued about when we get to what the Speaker's powers if it ever has to be invoked.
Thank you. I'm most grateful to the Father of the House. Mr. Kyle? No. Mr. Christopher Leslie.
Mr. Speaker, there are only two issues I think that come out of this debate. The first is about honour. The Right Honourable Member for Beaconsfield tried to make sure he got a deal from the Prime Minister. He went there with other members to negotiate with her, and she made a promise to him about an amendment. But that promise was not necessarily fulfilled in the interpretation of those members who heard her say that. So the House of Lords had to send back this particular issue today. Now, this issue is definitely about honour because, of course, other members have said they believe that the House can pass resolutions, can pass motions, and even if they aren't necessarily binding, they will be honoured. I believe that the Right Honourable Member for Beaconsfield is an honourable man, and he's again taking the government at their word, which takes us to the second issue, because this was about Parliament. And if he has achieved anything, he has moved the government from where the Prime Minister was on the Andrew Marr programme on Sunday, when the Prime Minister said, quote, "Parliament cannot tie the hands of government." That's where the Prime Minister was on Sunday. He's managed to extract a statement from the government now saying that it is open for members to table motions, that parliamentary time will be provided, and that it is open for this House and through the Speaker to make sure that motions and decisions can be made. He believes that this is worth having, and it is indeed true that this is a step forward. The difference that I have with him is he believes that the Prime Minister and the government should be given the benefit of the doubt yet again. I would suggest that he shouldn't and couldn't necessarily trust their word. That is where we differ.
2-minute limit. Sir William Cash.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. There is just one fundamental point which I would like to make about this debate, and that is this, that the decision that was taken in the Referendum Act by 6 to 1, the primacy of this House of Commons and in the House of Lords which endorsed it, was to accept that the people of this country would make the decision and not 650 members of Parliament when that decision was taken in the referendum. One word I only need to say about that is this, that we operate in this country and under our constitutional arrangements under a system of parliamentary government, not government by Parliament.
And Mr. Chris Bryant, 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, when I was training to be a priest in the Church of England, my professor of systematic theology was called John Macquarie, and he would often say that he was often asked by parishioners, what is the meaning of God? But actually, the far more important question is, what is the meaning of meaning? And to be honest, that's what it feels as if this afternoon's debate and last week's debate has been about. What is a meaningful vote? And the first answer is a meaningful vote is surely not one which is meaningless. We had a meaningless vote on Monday afternoon on the SO24 debate. It was meaningless because we were considering whether this House has considered the matter of the Sewell Convention. Even if every single member of the House had voted against that, we would nonetheless have considered the matter. This is exactly what we do in statutory instruments as well. We vote on whether we have considered the matter. The government's motion will require the government, not allow the government, require the government to table a neutral motion. And I would just disagree with the honourable member for Somerset North East. He said that the vote in 1940 was on the adjournment. It wasn't. It was on whether this House should adjourn for a successive number of days, which was an amendable motion and had effect. And would have had effect. I'm not going to give way to him if he doesn't mind. It was an amendable. I'm not. Oh, all right.
I did say it was on the Whitsun recess. I think I covered that point.
But you managed to, the honourable member managed to elide the fact that it was an amendable motion and had effect. The point is here, if the government does what its motion says it should do, namely table a neutral motion, I do not think that the written ministerial statement gives the Speaker any power whatsoever to decide that it is not a neutral statement. It gives him absolutely no power. And indeed, if a Speaker were to decide that a neutral motion was suddenly somehow or other not neutral and could be amended, we should remove the Speaker from the chair because he would not be abiding by the standing orders of this House. So, let us make it absolutely clear. Let us make it absolutely clear. If it's a neutral motion, it will be a motion that has no meaning whatsoever.
Tubery.
That's Mr. Speaker.
Oh no.
That's out of order. Mr. Speaker, I am concerned that the editor of the Daily Mail has made a small doll that looks like me and is sticking pins in its throat. Because every time I want to speak, I get this wretched infection. But I want to make some very important points, if I may. I completely agree with all the arguments advanced by the Honourable Member for Edinburgh. And history will record what a remarkably brave woman she has been throughout all of this. And I too will be voting for this amendment because I agree with much of what has been said. This needs to be in statute. Now, I'm going to pay real tribute to my right honourable and learned friend, the member for Beaconsfield, who has yet again shown outstanding leadership and courage, as indeed have many honourable members in the House of Lords. And in tribute to them, if nothing else, I shall be voting for this amendment. But primarily, I shall be voting for this amendment because it's in the interests of all my constituents. I was elected to come here to represent all of them. That's the 53 50% that didn't vote for me, and it's the 48% that voted to remain, who've been sidelined and abused. And the big mistake that we have made is from the outset of all that has followed from the referendum result, we have not included them. And finally, Mr. Speaker, I would say gently to the member for Shipley, what he has to remember is that there are honourable members who will be voting with the government today as an act of faith and trust in the Prime Minister, that sort of comment will no longer exist in this party, and that we will be more united. And it's her role, if I may say, to make sure that we have more temperate speeches.
Mr. George Howarth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Like my right honourable friend, the member for Leeds Central, I hold the right honourable learned gentleman for Beaconsfield in very high regard for his integrity and his fluency. I do, however, say very gently that he is in danger of turning into a modern-day grand old Duke of York. And there are only so many times you can march the troops up the hill and down again without losing completely integrity. I just want to, in the little time that's remaining to Mr. Speaker, to talk about negative motions, which is the centre of this dispute.
Order. The question is that Amendment B be made. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. Aye. Division, clear the lobby. Order. The question is that Amendment B be made. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No. Tellers for the ayes, Jeff Smith and Nick Smith. Tellers for the noes, Stuart Andrew and Andrew Stevenson.
Lock the doors!
Order.
The ayes to the right, 303. The noes to the left, 319.
Thank you. The ayes to the right, 303. The noes to the left, 319. So the noes have it. The noes have it. Unlock. The question is the government motion that this House agrees with the Lords in their amendments 19C to 19E, 19G to 19L, and 19P, and proposes the amendments to Lord's Amendment 19P as on the amendment paper. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye! Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order. I must now put a single question to agree with the Lords in all of the remaining Lords' proposals. I simply remind the House of that with which I feel sure it is closely familiar. 4B to 4E, 24C, and 110B to 110J. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye! Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order. We now come to the general debate. Order. I hesitated only because a couple of members had beetled up to the chair indicating a desire to raise points of order, but they don't now seem inclined to do so. We now come... Ah! Indeed. Yes, very well. OK, members who don't wish to attend to these points of order could beetle out of the chamber quickly and quietly. That will be very much to the advantage of the House. If members who are leaving could do so quickly and quietly, it would then be possible for me to hear the points of order. Point of order, Mr. Damien Moore.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, what means do I have to correct the record that Prime Minister's questions today, my neighbour, the Honourable Member for Wigan, may have inadvertently cited my honourable friends, the Prime Minister and the Secretary of State for Transport, in being responsible for a timetabling issue that affects my constituency, and that the emails she referenced were 3 years old and at a time when neither of my honourable friends were in their current roles. The timetabling issue and the current disruption are separate issues. I will continue to work with my honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Transport, to ensure that the best service for my constituents is met, and felt that it was important to bring this point to the House.
Well, I'm most grateful to the honourable gentleman for his courtesy in giving me advance notice of his intention to raise this attempted point of order, upon which the sagacious advice of the senior procedural adviser of the House is that it... Forgive me, it wasn't much of a point of order, but nevertheless, the honourable gentleman's not in a small minority in that regard. If it is any comfort to the honourable gentleman, I can assure him that certainly in my 21 years' experience in the House, the vast majority of points of order are bogus.
You used to do it.
And, well, the honourable
honourable gentleman, the member for Wellingborough, suggests that I used to do it. Well, I mean, I don't remember that. But if I did, I don't remember that. But if I did, all I would say to the honourable gentleman, the member for Wellingborough, is that was then, and this is now. And point of order, Lisa Nandy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Further to that point of order, I'm sure the honourable gentleman was as shocked as I was to read the content of many of those emails that were released to both him and me under the Freedom of Information Act, the content of which has had such serious implications for my constituents and his. Given that the department has not released emails during the current Secretary of State for Transport's tenure and has stopped at the point at which the current Secretary of State was appointed, I wonder if I could seek your guidance as to whether it might be in order to direct the Secretary of State to release those emails and come clean about what he knew and when.
Well, I don't think it is open to me to issue any direction of the kind that the honourable lady suggests, but the honourable gentleman made his point in all sincerity, the honourable gentleman member for Southport, and it is on the record, and now the honourable lady, who is at least equally dexterous, has made her own point in her own way, and it is on the record, and I rather imagine that each of them will rely upon those words, and as doubtless they cooperate in future on this important matter. Very dexterous. I'm very... Well, the honourable lady, the member for Wigan, now basks in the glory of approval from a member who is in his 40th year of consecutive service in the House, the honourable gentleman, the member for Huddersfield. If there are no further points of order, colleagues, we now come, after all the excitements, to the general debate on NATO. I call the Secretary of State for Defence to move the motion, Secretary Gavin Williamson.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. As we look around this chamber, we see plaques on the walls, such as that as for Major Ronald Cartland, killed in action during the retreat to Dunkirk, Lieutenant Colonel Somerset Arthur Maxwell, who died of wounds received at the Battle of El Alamein, for Captain George Grey, killed in action fighting in Normandy. These are just some of the men who served as members in this House, who lost their lives defending our country in the Second World War. And they remind us of the sacrifice that people have made so that we can enjoy the freedoms and democracy of today. But they are only a small number of those from every part of our country and every part of the Commonwealth who gave everything that they had to save our nation from one of the greatest threats that we have ever faced. It is all too easy to forget the price that they paid. We in this House have never been in a situation in which the actual existence of our country has been called into question. But while the sacrifice and service of so many delivered victory in 1945, we should not forget, Mr. Speaker, that Britain continued facing a real and enduring danger after that moment. And then, of course, yes.
It's stronger than that in a way, isn't it? Ronald Cartland was at Cassel, on the corner between Dunkirk and Calais, when the evacuation was happening at Dunkirk. They stayed at Cassel, knowing that they would almost certainly lose their lives if they stayed the extra day. So it's a phenomenal sacrifice that they made, knowing that death was coming, to be able to stand there to protect others.
The right honourable gentleman is absolutely correct, and the sacrifice that of not just one, but of so many, in order for us to have what we have today, is something that is so difficult to ever be able to articulate in a speech or to be able to convey. And I think it is so often forgotten by all of us of actually the sacrifice, the commitment, the dedication, not just those in the past, but those who continue to serve in our armed forces today. And that is why I think all of us in this House have a special duty towards them. And actually, after the Second World War, it wasn't something that actually peace and stability was not just something that we could take for granted. And it is when we turn to NATO and actually the tens of thousands of British servicemen and women who actually stepped up in order to protect our nation from new threats. Had it not been, though, for Ernest Bevin, who set out his vision of a joint Western military strategy, had he not helped sell the idea to the United States and to other nation-states, it is doubtful that NATO would have been born. And had it not been for the willingness of Clement Attlee's government to support the idea, but also the continued backing of successive Conservative and Labour governments, then this great strategic military alliance would never have got off the ground, let alone grown and matured into the great military alliance that has protected us for almost 70 years. And it's well worth reminding ourselves what NATO has achieved in the decade since its birth. It has consolidated the post-World War II transatlantic link. It has prevented the re-emergence of conflicts that had dogged Europe literally for centuries. It has led operations in the Balkans to Afghanistan. What would have happened if NATO had not held firm during the bitter chill of the Cold War? Would the Berlin Wall still stand casting its shadow over the West? Would millions of lives people be still living free, secure and prosperous? And even as we enter a new age of warfare, NATO continues to adapt to the times. Of course, I would.
My right honourable friend, and may I congratulate him on the way in which he has framed this debate, which is very appropriate. But may I just ask him this? It is true that NATO played and has played and continues to play an irreplaceable role in the security of the West. But NATO faces immense challenges, which I know he'll come on to talk about, not only without, but also within. And one of them is NATO's inability to transform itself fast enough against the current concept of challenges which it faces, which are quite outside anything that it has ever faced before, and for which it is, in fact, remarkably ill-equipped to do it. Will he therefore agree with me that it is incumbent on the governments of the 29 members to make it a part of the 2018 NATO summit, that transformation must proceed apace, and that the political as well as the military will of those governments must be reflected in those decisions?
My right honourable friend is absolutely right. If we do not change not just our military structures to make sure that they can best respond, but also the political structures that actually the military structures will turn to in order to get their direction, if we do not change, if we do not reform, if we do not have the agility in order to respond to the enemies that this nation faces and our allies face, if we do not do that, then actually it will be an organisation that is found wanting. Of course.
I right honourable for giving way. The President of the Chancellor's Exchequer in the chamber just before he ran out the door prompts me to raise with the Secretary of State the question of funding. Will he reconfirm the notion that our 2% of GDP is not a target but is an absolute floor?
Yes.
And that if we are to stand true with our friends in NATO, we must aim for 2.5% or 3% of GDP. Otherwise, we simply will not be able to do what we are seeking to do in the world.
Marvellous.
Well, with my right honourable friend, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, peering at me, I feel as if I have to be on my very best of behaviour. We've always seen 2% as a floor, and spending on defence has varied over years. I think when we came into government, I think it was actually at a slightly higher level than 2%. Indeed, when my right honourable friend was Secretary of State for Defence, I think it was at 2.3 and 2.4, but that was in consideration of the operations that we're involved in terms of Afghanistan at the time. But we do have to I will happily give way to the honourable gentleman.
Most grateful. So far as the floor is concerned, is that FLAW or FLOOR? Sorry. So far as the floor, my right friend was talking about, the 2%, is that FLAW or FLOOR?
2% is very much a floor as we see it, the base on which to build upon. And we can be very proud as a nation within NATO, being one of a few nations that actually meet the 2% commitment. We can be exceptionally proud of the fact that actually under the leadership of my right honourable friend, the member for Sevenoaks, and of course for the work that had been done by the Chancellor of the Exchequer before he moved on to the Foreign Office, there is a lot of work that had been done in establishing the fact that all NATO members needed to be spending more. But if I can have the opportunity... Yes,
I'm very grateful to the Secretary of State. There are various metrics by which one can measure our defence investment in peacetime, and one is how it compares with spending on other high expenditure departments such as health, education and welfare. And does he recall that as recently as the 1980s we were spending roughly the same on defence as we were spending on health and education? Now, I'm not saying we should repeat that, but certainly when we are spending 2.5 times on education as we spend on defence and 4 times on health what we spend on defence, and that was before the recent rise, doesn't he believe that defence has fallen a bit too far down the scale of our national priorities?
Yeah. Well, I can see the excitement in the Chancellor's face as he was outlining such proposals, and I wasn't sure if that was an agreement from the Chancellor of the Exchequer that we should be setting those targets going forward, but I'm sure that is something that we'll have to negotiate over a long period of time. But what we need to be doing as we move onto the issue of NATO is actually making sure that NATO is and continues to adapt to the times and also to the threats that NATO faces. And what we have always seen is Britain leading from the front, right from its creation and to today. Not only do we assign our independent nuclear deterrent to the defence of the alliance, as we have done for the last 56 years, but our service personnel are on the ground in Eastern Europe at this very moment, providing a deterrence against Russian aggression. It has been my privilege to see their dedication and devotion to duty in Estonia, where we are leading a multinational battle group, in Poland, where they're supporting the United States forces, and at the same time, our sailors are commanding half of NATO's standing naval forces. Our pilots, ground crew and aircraft have returned to the Black Sea region, based in Romania, to police the skies of our southeastern European allies. Just last year, UK forces led the Very High Readiness Joint Task Force and became the first ally to deliver cyber capabilities in support of NATO operations. Meanwhile, UK personnel form a critical part of NATO's command structure. So I'm proud that the UK will be sending more than 100 additional UK personnel to bolster that command structure, taking our total to well over 1,000. And actually, as we look at the threats that are emerging, as we look at the challenges that our nation faces going forward, we have to make sure that NATO has the resources, it has the capability, it has the people in order to man those command structures, in order for us to meet those threats. NATO needs the extra support to deal with the growing threats. The dangers we're facing are multiplying all the time, and they're coming from every direction. We're confronting a host of new threats, from extremism to cyber warfare, dangers global in nature that require an international response and a global presence. We're witnessing the rise of rogue states, those states conducting proxy wars and causing regional instability, while old threats are returning. Russia is a case in point. If we go back to 2010, Russia was not clearly identified as a threat. The focus of our attention was very much in terms of ungoverned spaces, areas such as Afghanistan and Iraq. But by the time we reached 2015, the emergence of new threats were becoming apparent to everyone. And that acceleration has increased. That threat has accelerated and has increased over the last 3 years. In 2010, our Royal Navy was called on just once to respond to a Russian naval ship approaching UK territorial waters. Last year, that number was 33 times. Russian submarine activity has increased tenfold in the North Atlantic, a level not seen since the Cold War. They're also investing in new technology that they're aiming to outpace our capability. And what they're wanting to do is they want to concentrate on our weaknesses, our vulnerabilities, and we have to be realistic and accept that we're going to have to invest in new capabilities to deal with these new threats.
Will the Secretary of State give way?
I will do.
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way. He's absolutely right that there is a re-emergence of a peer-on-peer threat. And whilst there are some great new pieces of kit recently entering service with our Army, Navy and Air Force, I wonder if he agrees with me that the pace of their arrival and the new capabilities that will augment them cannot arrive soon enough as we make sure that we are capable once again of fighting against our peers, not just counterinsurgency operations.
I think my honourable friend is absolutely right. The pace and delivery of both the new equipment and the support that we give our armed forces, it's an important part of what we need to deliver for them, making sure that they get that new equipment, that new kit, that new capability as swiftly as we can. And if we look at what our Air Force has been doing, our planes have been scrambled 38 times since 2012 in response to Russian military aircraft. Russia continues to use its cyberbots, fake news to undermine democracies across the world, and we've seen very clear examples of that, whether that is in Montenegro, whether that is in Estonia. And we, of course, ourselves have seen the shocking attack in Salisbury, the first offensive nerve agent attack on European streets since the Second World War. So plenty to focus our minds on as we head to the Brussels summit. And that's why earlier this month at the NATO defence ministers' meetings, we took decisions alongside our allies to further strengthen NATO's command structure, enhancing its naval presence and putting in place the right capabilities to defend the Euro-Atlantic area as it is increasingly threatened. And that's why we took that opportunity to clarify our 3 priorities for that pivotal summit meeting in July.
On that subject,
of course,
I'm very grateful to the Defence Secretary for giving way. On the issue of the Brussels summit, whilst it is true that NATO is inestimably more important in collective defence than the European Union, nevertheless, Europe's nascent defence capability has shown itself to have some utility. When we leave the European Union, what will our response be to things that have worked, such as Operation Atalanta and the EU battle groups, which the UK has been a very important part of?
Well, we've always been very clear with the European Union. The interests of European security are very much our interests. It's always been our interest before we joined the European Union, and they'll certainly be in our interest afterwards. We're very open to discussions about how we can continue to work with our partners, working and leading if and when it is appropriate. And we mustn't underestimate our capability compared to other European nations. We are at the leading edge, and we're one of the very, very few European nations that can lead operations and can make a real difference. And we recognise the fact that actually, as we leave the European Union, we want to have very strong and good relationships, not just in terms of operations, but also in terms of defence strategy, in terms of procurement, and also industrial strategy going forward. So we'll continue to work closely. I give way to my honourable friend.
Secretary of State for giving way. My constituency of Stevenage is home to Astrium, which is involved in the Galileo project, and MBDA, which manufactures brimstone and C-Septon and a variety of other products that keep our country safe. That shows the strength of bilateral relationships and the importance of procurement. Is the Secretary of State confident that that will continue to happen going forward?
I'm very confident that we're able to reach agreement in terms of how we move forward, and we mustn't forget that actually 90% of actually what we do and the relationships we have with other European nations in terms of defence, the defence industry, 90% of them are actually on a bilateral basis as against through the European Union, and that's something we'll look to continue to strengthen going forward. But as we look forward to the NATO summit, first and foremost, we need to accept we have to invest more in defence. We need allies to step up and spend a minimum of 2%. This is something that the United Kingdom has led on ever since the Wales NATO summit in 2014, and our efforts have encouraged all allies to increase their spending. More are meeting that target, most having plans to reach it. As the NATO Secretary-General said earlier this month, non-US spending has increased by £87 billion between 2014 and 2018. But still the US accounts for more than 70% of its combined defence expenditure. When Britain leaves the European Union, 82% of NATO's contribution will come from non-EU countries. But we have to be honest with ourselves. We can't continue to expect US taxpayers to keep picking up the tab for European defence indefinitely. Nor can we expect US patience to last forever. We as a continent have to step up to the responsibility of playing a pivotal role in defending ourselves and not to expect others to do it for us. But today presents us with an opportunity to play a bigger role in defence. Our next priority will be about making sure the alliance is ready to act rapidly. My right honourable friend touched upon this issue at the start of the debate. We need to be able to act within weeks, within days, within hours, not within months. I give way to my right honourable friend.
The honourable gentleman, and he will remember wearing a different hat the discussions we had on this issue roughly about a year ago today on this issue of NATO defence spending. I would like him just to spell out in more detail about the other countries that he mentioned who were not contributing to the 2% threshold. Can I ask him to tell the House, when are we going to have some of the major partners in Europe reach the 2%? What's his estimation of when they will get to that point? They are spending more, but when are they likely to reach that threshold?
I remember very well the discussions a year ago. I kind of wish he had demanded maybe a few more ships to be built in Harland and Wolff, a third aircraft carrier or something like that. But what we expect is, we expect by 2024, we expect 14 nations to be meeting the 2% target. By the end of this year, we expect 8 nations to be meeting that 2% target. But, you know, that still is not going far enough. And, of course, some of the largest economies in Europe continue to lag considerably behind that. We do need to ensure that every nation, whether it be Britain or Estonia, which are meeting their 2% target, does encourage those nations, such as Germany and others, to also take the opportunity to be spending 2% on defence. And I would always give them an open offer. If they didn't know how to spend it, I'm sure we could do it for them. But when we actually look at how we make NATO ready for the future, as I was touching upon, yes, I would give.
Can I thank the Secretary of State for giving way? Can I just ask him, just before we got onto the point raised by the Right Honourable Member for Belfast North, he mentioned about logistics and forward planning. Can he update the House on what the government's thinking is about rebasing in Germany, given our continuing commitment to withdraw from Germany?
The Right Honourable Gentleman makes a very important point in terms of the issue of readiness and our ability to be able to respond, and it was something that I was going to touch on a little bit later, and please feel free to intervene at a later stage if I need to sort of make some more clarity on the point. I'll give way to my own friend.
I'm most grateful to my right honourable friend, and just to touch back on the naval issue and about equipping NATO, my right honourable friend agree with me that actually it's not just about increasing the level of spending to 2%, but where that is invested, and that actually the Royal Navy is going through this period in our history now of complete renewal and having some of the most advanced ships in the world and advanced capabilities. And will my right honourable friend be making representations, especially at water, about the need to renew and have leading technology, especially against the threat of Russian naval technology, especially in comparison to the United States, who are going backwards in some of the technology with the failed Zandvoort-class destroyers and going back to Astley-class destroyers?
Yes, I mean, we can be very proud in terms of what we've invested in terms of technology, whether it's the new Poseidon aircraft, in terms of which will operate over the North Atlantic, whether it's the new Type 26 frigates which are currently being constructed in Glasgow. We are leading the world in terms of the technology that we're developing and the technology that we're investing in. And nations such as the United States actually look to us to take that leadership role, to paint the way forward and actually take responsibility for making sure that the North Atlantic routes remain safe. I'll give way to the Honourable Gentleman. I know he's trying to get in earlier.
Can I thank the Secretary of State for giving way? On the subject of the readiness of our armed forces, can he tell us about the government's record on recruitment into the army? We're really worried the government is making insufficient progress on this really important issue.
The key, what we are doing everything we can do, and my right honourable friend, the Minister for the Armed Forces, is taking a lead on this, is making sure, firstly, that we meet all our operational requirements, but most importantly, changing the way we do recruitment so that actually we're able to fill up the army to the numbers that we've said that we wanted to sort of reach of 82,000, and those are changes that my right honourable friend is leading. But if I can take the opportunity, to make some, I've been very generous in my taking interventions. If the honourable gentleman will let me make some progress, and so what we need to be doing is looking at how we ensure that NATO is able to respond swiftly to changing threats. As I touched upon, not within months, not just within weeks, but in days and hours, and not simply in land, sea and air, but in the new grey danger zones of cyberspace and space itself. For that to happen, our alliance must keep changing and adapting to deal with the new threats. It must reform itself structurally so there are far fewer barriers to action. And NATO must reform itself politically so nations can swiftly agree on measures to take and how to use the power at their disposal decisively, particularly when it comes to cyber and hybrid attacks, which often occur beneath the normal threshold for a collective response. Lastly, NATO must maintain the mass needed to assemble, reinforce and win a conflict in Europe at short notice. We need to look at how we can forward base more of our equipment and possibly personnel. That's why today we're looking hard at our infrastructure in Germany, particularly our vehicle storage, heavy transport and training facilities. And along with our NATO allies, we are continually testing our agility and responsiveness through exercises in Europe. We need to do more and look more closely at how we can have the forces that we need to deal with the threats that we're facing today. The threats today are so different than the threats in 2010, but we shouldn't underestimate our adversaries' intent and our willingness in order to use military force.
Will the Secretary of State allow me briefly?
Of course.
I see the Chancellor of the Exchequer is no longer with us. But I don't think it escaped his notice that this was a very well-attended debate. Can I say to the Secretary of State, when he gave evidence to the Select Committee, he told us it would take 90 days to mobilise our warfighting division and deploy it to the Baltic states in an emergency. Can you give the House any reassurance that under the Managing the Defence programme, we're looking at that again, and whether we might be able to come up with one?